Hey, welcome back, friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you're curled up in bed right now, lying on the couch with the lights dimmed, or maybe you just pressed play and you're about to drift off into that lovely quiet space between awake and asleep, I want you to know this story was made exactly for you. Tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about money, but not the kind of money conversation that makes your head hurt. No spreadsheets, no interest rates, no stress. We're going to talk about the women who had no legal right to own money and somehow, quietly, cleverly, across hundreds of years of medieval Europe, they managed it anyway. Here is what blows my mind. In the year 1200, a woman in England could get married in the morning, and by the afternoon she no longer legally existed. Not dead, not imprisoned, just gone, absorbed, swallowed whole by her husband's legal identity, her name still on her lips but nowhere on paper that mattered. And yet, and this is the part that keeps historians up at night, these same women were running estates, hiding savings, negotiating contracts, and building quiet financial empires that their husbands never even knew about. How? How do you build wealth when the law says you cannot own anything? How do you protect your future when you're legally considered the same person as the man you married? That is exactly what we're going to unravel tonight, slowly, gently, one story at a time. But before we go any further into this world, if you're enjoying what I bring to this little corner of the night, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. And honestly, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are right now. Are you in bed, on the couch? Maybe listening with headphones in a dark room somewhere I genuinely love, knowing where in the world these stories find you. Now let's make the room a little softer. Dim those lights if you can. Maybe turn on a gentle fan or let the quiet hum of the night settle around you. And let's step together into the medieval world where the rules were rigid, the stakes were enormous, and the women were far more clever than anyone in power gave them credit for. So let's start at the very beginning. Picture England, around the year 1200. The countryside is wide and cold. The roads are muddy paths between stone villages. The church bells mark the hours, and almost everything, the land, the livestock, the grain, in the storeroom, the coins under the floorboards, belongs to men. At least that is what the law would have you believe. Because this was the world of coverture, and if there is one word you take away from tonight, let it be that one. Coverture. Say it softly. Coverture. It comes from the old French meaning to cover, to shelter, to conceal, and that is exactly what it did to women. The legal doctrine of coverture held that when a woman married, her entire legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She became, in the eyes of the common law, a femme, covert, a covered woman. Covered, yes, but by what? Not a blanket, not a shield. By her husband's name, by his legal standing, by his authority over everything she had ever owned, earned, or been given. The medieval legal scholar Henry de Bracton, who wrote one of the most important legal treatises of the 13th century, put it plainly. He said that husband and wife were one person in law, one flesh, one blood, one legal identity, and he made it very clear who that one person was. The husband. A femme covert could not own property. She could not sign a legal contract. She could not sue in court. She could not even keep a salary she had earned if she worked her wages legally belonged to her husband. And here is the thing that always stops me cold when I think about it. This was not some extreme or unusual idea at the time. This was just normal. This was the air everyone breathed. This was simply the way the world was organized. Boys grew up knowing it. Girls grew up knowing it. The priest at the altar knew it. The lord of the manor knew it. Even the women themselves, in most cases, had simply accepted it as the natural order of things. Now I want to pause here for just a moment, because I can already hear some of you thinking, okay, but surely it was not that bad, right? Surely there were loopholes. Surely some women found a way around it. And the answer is yes. Absolutely yes. That is the whole reason we are here tonight. But I want you to fully feel the weight of the cage before we talk about how women slipped through its bars. Because the more clearly you understand just how total the legal restriction was, the more astonishing the workarounds become. So let's stay here in the cage just a little longer. Here is how it worked in practice. Imagine a woman named, let us call her Alice. Alice grows up in a small English village in, say, the year 1230. Her father owns a modest piece of land, a few acres, some animals, a cottage with a good thatched roof. He loves Alice, and before she marries he gives her a small chest of coins, perhaps the savings of years of careful work and some good linen, and a silver brooch her mother left her. Alice treasures these things. She has earned them in a way. They are hers. Then Alice marries Thomas, a decent man, a hard-working man, a man her father approves of, and on the morning after the wedding, every single thing in that chest, every coin, every piece of linen, every memory sewn into that silver brooch legally belongs to Thomas, not to Alice. Alice does not receive the brooch as a gift from her dead mother. Thomas received it, because Alice and Thomas are now legally the same person, and that person is Thomas. There is a quote I always come back to from a 19th century justice who was describing the doctrine, and it is so perfectly sharp it almost makes you laugh through the outrage. He said, and I am paraphrasing here very loosely, that though the husband and wife are one, the one is the husband. That line has sat with me for years. Though the husband and wife are one, the one is the husband. Now here is the thing about humans and about women specifically throughout history. When the official door is locked, they find the window. When the window is also locked, they find a loose brick in the wall. And when the entire building seems sealed tight, they start quietly laying the foundation for a different building altogether. And that is precisely what medieval women did. Not in one grand revolutionary moment, not with a protest or a pamphlet or a petition, but slowly, quietly, generation by generation, across the muddy fields and smoky great halls and narrow market lanes of medieval Europe, they built something extraordinary, a parallel financial world, hidden in plain sight. But before we understand how they managed money, we need to understand the world that money actually existed in. Because the medieval economy was not like anything we would recognize today. There were no banks, not in any sense you and I would understand, no savings accounts, no certificates of deposit, no little plastic card you could tap on a reader at the market stall. Coins, actual physical coins, were the backbone of everything, and even those were complicated. In England, the basic unit of currency was the silver penny, and there were not many of them. Medieval society was, as historians describe it, simultaneously deeply monetized and desperately short of money. What does that mean? It means that people understood the value of everything in monetary terms. A good horse was worth a certain number of shillings. A day's labour in the fields had a price. Even sins could be paid for in charitable donations. But the actual physical coins needed to complete these transactions were often scarce, unreliable, or of suspicious quality. Here is a small detail that I find absolutely fascinating. Archaeologists working in London excavated a cemetery from the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, a horrific period we'll touch on more later in our series. And they found something remarkable on one of the female skeletons. She had a small purse of low-value coins at her belt within easy reach, but hidden in her armpit, tucked against her body where no one would easily find it, was a separate cache of higher-value pieces. Even in death, this woman was guarding her hidden savings. Even at the very end, she had understood something fundamental. You keep what you need for today where people can see it. You keep what you need for tomorrow when nobody can reach it. That is not just medieval wisdom. That is timeless wisdom. That is the kind of quiet, steady thinking that kept women financially alive across centuries of legal erasure. So what did women do with money when they could not legally own it? How did they keep it? How did they grow it? How did they pass it on? The answers are going to surprise you, and the strategies they used are in many ways more sophisticated than anything you might expect from a world of mud and candlelight. First, let us talk about one of the most important and most overlooked truths about coverture. The law said one thing, life did another. Modern historians who have spent decades combing through medieval court records, parish accounts, land registers, and tax rolls have found something that the law books never quite captured. Married women all over England and Europe were quietly and routinely doing things they were technically not supposed to be able to do. They were appearing in local courts on their own behalf. They were entering into informal credit agreements with neighbours and merchants. They were negotiating the sale of grain and livestock on behalf of their households and keeping a careful mental ledger of what they were owed and what they owed in return. And in some English towns, and this is a crucial detail, the law itself had a built-in exception. The concept of the femme sole, the single woman. In cities like London, a married woman could under certain circumstances register herself as a femme sole merchant. This meant she could trade independently, take on debts in her own name, and be held legally responsible for her own business dealings separate from her husband entirely. It was a loophole, a narrow, specific, often difficult to access loophole, but it existed, and the women who knew about it used it. Now I want to tell you something about the physical reality of saving money in this world, because hiding wealth was not metaphorical, it was completely literally physical. Medieval households did not have safes, they did not have banks, they barely had locks that a determined person could not pick. So women and men too, to be fair, concealed their savings in the fabric of their daily lives. Coins were buried in the earthen floors of cottages, they were sealed inside the walls of buildings during construction, they were sewn into the hems of heavy cloaks, tucked inside the stuffing of mattresses, hidden in ceramic money boxes, small earthenware pots that could be bought cheaply at any market, which were then buried or sealed into the walls of the home. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these small clay pots across England dating from roughly the 1300s through the 1500s, and here is the detail that makes them so remarkable. These medieval money boxes, which scholars openly compare to what we would call a piggy bank today, were designed with no opening other than the slot at the top. To get the money out, you had to break the pot. You had to commit to spending it, which means the money inside stayed put. Because breaking that pot was a decision, it required intention, and for a woman who was carefully, secretly setting aside a little something for herself and her children, that small act of resistance was everything. There is something else I want you to feel here before we move deeper into the story, something that goes beyond the tactics and the workarounds. Because when you read about the legal world these women inhabited, when you really let it sink in, that a woman in medieval England could not sign her own name to a contract, could not keep money she earned, could not even claim ownership of the brooch her mother left her, you might expect to find only stories of despair, stories of helplessness, stories of women quietly accepting their erasure. But that is not what the historical record shows. What the historical record shows in court documents, in tax rolls, in estate accounts, in the few remarkable letters and wills that survive is women who were paying attention. Women who understood the system even if they could not openly change it. Women who found every available crack and pressed their fingers into it. They knew exactly how much grain was in the storehouse. They knew which merchant owed the estate money and which one always paid late. They knew how to manage a staff of 30 people without ever being officially in charge. And they knew perhaps most importantly how to make the people around them underestimate them. Because in a world where visibility meant vulnerability, invisibility was power, there is a line in a 13th century English legal text called Bracton that I find genuinely haunting. Bracton wrote that a woman's personal property, and he was careful to include her clothing and her jewellery, specifically could under certain readings of the law be considered her own. Her own. Her robes, her ornaments, the items given to her for her personal adornment. The great legal scholars of medieval England looked at the entire apparatus of a woman's life, her labour, her management, her intelligence, her strategic thinking, and deemed most of it the property of her husband. But the jewels she wore, those might just possibly be hers. It is hard not to read that as accidental poetry. Everything that was visible to the world, her work, her words, her decisions belonged to her husband. Only what was hidden against her skin might belong to her, and that in many ways is the whole story of women and money in the Middle Ages, hidden against the skin, tucked under the mattress, buried in the floor, sealed inside the walls, the great invisible economy of women built not with fanfare or legal recognition, but with patience and ingenuity and a very, very long memory. Tonight we're going to uncover it, all 12 chapters of it, and I promise you, by the time we are done, you will never look at the medieval world quite the same way again. You will see the women in the background of the tapestries differently. The ones carrying baskets, managing kitchens, bowing their heads to husbands in public, while quietly somewhere in the folds of their lives running the numbers that kept everything alive. So get comfortable, let the night settle around you, because we are just getting started, and in the next part of tonight's journey we're going to open something truly extraordinary. We're going to talk about the one financial weapon a woman was legally allowed to carry into her marriage, and how the sharpest women of the medieval world turned that single instrument into the foundation of an entire financial life. We are going into the world of the dowry, and I think it might surprise you. There is something about the word dowry that sounds almost romantic, doesn't it? Say it slowly. Dowry. It feels like something out of a fairy tale, a father handing his daughter a chest of gold coins on her wedding day, sending her off into a life of safety and comfort. But here is the truth that those fairy tales never tell you. The dowry was not romantic. The dowry was a negotiation, a calculated, carefully structured financial transaction between two families with the bride somewhere in the middle, often with very little say in how the whole thing was arranged. And yet, and this is what I want you to hold on to tonight, in the hands of the right woman, that same dowry became something extraordinary. It became the one crack in the wall that she could press her fingers into, the one financial instrument she arrived with that no one could take away from her quite so cleanly as everything else. Let's talk about it. So first things first, what actually was a dowry? In the medieval world, the dowry was the property, money, land, livestock, household goods that a bride's family transferred to the groom at the time of marriage. Notice I said to the groom, not to the bride. The money did not belong to her. It passed from her father's hands directly into her husband's control. In England, by the 13th century, this process was largely automatic under common law. The moment the church bells rang and the vows were spoken, everything the bride brought with her legally became his. Her wool blankets, his. Her father's coins, his. The small parcel of land her uncle had left her, his. Now this might make you wonder, why bother with the dowry at all? Why not just keep the daughter's inheritance in the family and skip the whole arrangement? The answer is a little uncomfortable, but it is historically honest, because daughters in the medieval framework were not permanent members of their birth family. They were understood to be temporary. They would leave, join a new household, and their loyalty as well as their labour Their fertility and their financial resources would transfer accordingly. The dowry was the family's one-time payment for placing their daughter in a household of comparable or hopefully superior social standing. It was bluntly the price of a good match, and the size of that price mattered enormously. In Venice during the 14th century, dowry inflation became such a serious social crisis that wealthy families were spending themselves into ruin trying to secure prestigious husbands for their daughters. In Florence, fathers started depositing money into something called the Monte delle Doti, a kind of government dowry fund established in the year 1425, which allowed them to invest a smaller sum when a girl was young and collect a larger amount by the time she was marriageable. It was functionally a savings bond for your daughter's future husband, which, when you think about it, is both remarkably clever and deeply strange. But now let me tell you about the other side of this arrangement, because the dowry is only half of the story. There was also something called the dower, and the dower is where it gets genuinely interesting. The dower, not to be confused with the dowry, though people muddle them constantly, was the legal right of a widow to receive a portion of her husband's estate upon his death. In England, under common law, that portion was 1/3. 1/3 of everything her husband had owned during their marriage. She could not sell it. She could not give it away during his lifetime. She could not touch it while he lived, but it was hers waiting like a promise written in law, and when he died, it activated. Now I want you to just sit with the implications of that for a moment. Think about what this means. A medieval noblewoman might spend 20 years of her life under coverture, legally invisible, financially dependent, unable to sign a contract or own property in her own name. But the entire time, quietly embedded in the legal structure of her marriage, was this guaranteed inheritance. 1/3, waiting, like a slow fire. And the women who understood this really understood it, planned accordingly. Let me tell you about a woman whose story perfectly illustrates just how far a woman could travel with the right combination of dowry, dower, and sheer determination. Her name was Elizabeth Hardwick, though history knows her better as Bess of Hardwick, and she is one of the most remarkable financial architects of the medieval and early modern world. Bess was born around the year 1521 or possibly 1527. Historians still argue into a family of minor gentry in Derbyshire, England. Nothing spectacular about her origins. Her father died when she was very young, leaving the family in financial difficulty. She had no grand dowry. In fact, when she entered her first marriage at around 15 years old to a young man named Robert Barlow, who was only 13 or 14, her dowry was modest, somewhere around 40 to 60 marks, depending on how you interpret the legal documents. That is not a lot. Robert died within a year of their wedding, and young Bess, barely 16, widowed before she had barely begun, applied immediately for her dower rights. 1/3 of Robert Barlow's estate. She fought for it through the proper legal channels, and she got it. It was not much, but it was hers, and she paid attention to every detail of that process. What followed was a lifetime of extraordinarily strategic marriages. Her second husband, Sir William Cavendish, was a significantly wealthier man, and Bess persuaded him remarkably to sell his estates in the south of England and buy land in Derbyshire instead. Her home county, her territory, the land she understood. He died, and she got her dower. Her third husband, Sir William St. Lo, was wealthier still, and when he died, Bess managed to secure a significant portion of his estate, partly because she'd been carefully managing the financial affairs of the household throughout their marriage. And then came the fourth, George Talbot VI, Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the richest men in England. When Shrewsbury died in the year 1590, Bess of Hardwick became one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire kingdom. Not just one of the wealthiest women, one of the wealthiest people. She used that fortune to build two of the most significant houses in Elizabethan England, Chatsworth House and Hardwick Hall. Hardwick Hall, which still stands today, bears her initials carved into the stone towers ES for Elizabeth Shrewsbury. Because she wanted the world to know. She was there. She had been there the whole time. And she built something that would outlast every husband, every legal restriction, every document that had ever tried to make her invisible. Now I want to pause here because I think there is a common mistake people make when they hear a story like Bess of Hardwick's. They think, well, she was exceptional, she was extraordinary. Most women could never have done what she did, and that is partly true. Bess operated at the very top of the social hierarchy where the stakes were highest and the resources were greatest. But the strategy she used, the careful attention to dower rights, the deliberate accumulation of knowledge about exactly what was legally hers and what was not, the refusal to let any single marriage define her final position, that was not unique to Bess. Variations of that strategy were being practiced by women across the entire social spectrum of medieval Europe, not with the same results, not with the same scale, but with the same fundamental understanding, which is this: if the law gives you one guaranteed instrument, and in medieval England for married women, the dower was often the closest thing to that you study that instrument until you know it better than anyone, and then you use it. Here is another angle I want to explore because I think it complicates the story in a really valuable way. Let's talk about what happened when women had no dowry. What happened to the daughters who arrived at marriage empty-handed? The picture is not a simple one. In many parts of medieval Europe, a woman without a dowry simply had fewer options, fewer potential husbands, lower status matches, sometimes no match at all. In some Italian cities during the 14th and 15th centuries, families of modest means, who could not assemble a sufficient dowry, would send their daughters to convents instead, not necessarily out of religious devotion, but because the convent required a smaller payment than a husband's family would demand. It was a financial decision disguised as a spiritual one, and the Catholic Church actually recognized this as a problem. St. Nicholas, yes, the one who eventually became the basis for Santa Claus, was celebrated in medieval tradition precisely because of a legend that he provided anonymous dowries to 3 poor sisters who would otherwise have had no future. The painting of this scene by Fra Angelico from around the year 1437 shows gold coins being tossed through a window at night, secretly, in the dark. Even the most charitable impulse of the era understood that money for women moved best when no one was watching. And here is something that I find quietly astonishing. Some medieval families developed workarounds so sophisticated that they essentially invented what we today would call a prenuptial agreement. In England, wealthier families began using legal devices called separate estates, or trusts, where a bride's property was formally conveyed to a small group of trusted individuals before the wedding. Those trustees then held the property legally, not the husband, not the bride, the trustees, with instructions to manage it for her benefit. This meant that in theory, if the husband ran into debt or died in disgrace, the property in the trust was protected. It belonged to the trustees, and through them functionally to her. Historians estimate that by the early modern period, something like 10% of English marriages involved some form of legally enforceable device to protect the wife's property from full absorption under coverture. 10% sounds small, but think about what it represents. 10% of families were smart enough, determined enough, legally savvy enough to thread the needle of the law and carve out a protected space for the woman entering marriage. That is not nothing. That is a quiet revolution happening in the paperwork. And then there were the poor, the women who had no access to lawyers or trustees or legal strategies of any kind. For them, the dowry was something altogether more humble, a few coins saved over years of careful work, a piece of furniture passed down from a grandmother, a good linen sheet folded carefully representing months of spinning and weaving. These women carried their modest wealth into marriage in the only way available to them physically, sewn into hems, tucked inside the stuffing of mattresses, hidden in the lining of travelling bags. Their financial planning was not written in legal documents, it was written into the fabric of their lives, and it deserves exactly the same respect. Let me leave you with one thought before we move forward. There is a tendency when we look back at the Middle Ages to see women purely as victims of the financial systems they lived under, trapped, controlled, passive. But the evidence tells a different story, from the noblewoman who carefully tracked her dower entitlements across multiple marriages, to the merchant's daughter who persuaded her father to negotiate specific protections into her marriage contract to the peasant woman who kept her small savings hidden somewhere her husband would never think to look. What you see consistently across centuries and social classes is women paying close attention, watching the rules, learning them better often than the men around them, and finding in the smallest available spaces the room to act. That is not passivity. That is a specific kind of intelligence that history has been very slow to recognize, and tonight we're going to keep recognizing it. Because here is the thing about the dowry and the dower, as clever as those instruments were, they required a wedding and often a death to activate. They were reactive. What about the women who did not want to wait? What about the women who built their own financial world without needing either a marriage or a funeral to get started? Those women exist too. And they did it in the most unexpected place you can imagine. They did it in the kitchen, with a barrel of grain, a pot of water, and a fire. Picture this for a moment. You wake up before sunrise. The house is cold. Your husband is still asleep. And in the quiet grey light of early morning, before the children stir, and before the day swallows you whole, you build up the fire, carry water from the well, and begin doing something that the law will never acknowledge as work. You begin to brew, and with every hour that the grain steeps and the liquid darkens and the slow miracle of fermentation gets quietly underway, you are, without anyone quite noticing, building a financial life for yourself. This is the story of the medieval alewife, and I think it might be the most quietly radical story in this entire series. Let's start with something so basic it might seem obvious, but I want you to really feel it. Medieval people did not drink water the way we do, not primarily, not casually. The water sources available to most people in medieval England, rivers, wells, streams near settlements, were frequently contaminated. Livestock grazed nearby. Human waste entered the groundwater. There were no treatment systems, no filtration, no understanding of bacteria in any modern sense. Ale, on the other hand, was safe. The process of brewing soaking grain, boiling the liquid, allowing it to ferment, naturally eliminated most of the dangerous organisms that made raw water so treacherous. And the alcohol content, while low by today's standards, acted as a preservative. Ale was not just a drink. It was nutrition, hydration, and public health rolled into a single wooden barrel. A typical medieval family of 5 might have needed something in the range of 9 gallons of ale per week, just to meet their basic needs. 9 gallons, every week, without stopping. Agricultural labourers were sometimes paid partly in ale rather than in coin, because ale was that valuable and that necessary. Think about what that means economically. This was not a luxury product. This was not something people purchased occasionally for special occasions. This was the lifeblood of daily medieval life, as fundamental as bread, and in many communities nearly as common. And until the middle of the 14th century, almost all of it was made by women. Let me pause here because this next part matters enormously. Brewing ale in medieval England was not a specialised craft that required years of training or guild membership or expensive equipment. It required large pots, vats for soaking, ladles and straining cloths, a fire, grain, water. These were all things that already lived inside a medieval household as part of ordinary domestic life, which means that any woman who managed a household was already sitting next to everything she needed to begin a small brewing enterprise. All she had to do was make a little more than her family needed and sell the rest. This is what historians call producing for surplus, a strategy so simple and so elegant that it barely registers as a strategy at all. You do not need a business plan. You do not need startup capital. You do not need anyone's permission. You just brew more than you need, and then someone knocks on your door wanting to buy it. The historian Judith Bennett, who has spent decades studying this world, and whose book on the subject remains one of the most important works in the field, described it this way: brewing and selling ale allowed women to work for and achieve good profits, social power, and some measure of independence from men that other trades simply did not offer. Good profits, social power, independence. These are not small things. These were revolutionary things dressed up as housework. Now I want to put some real numbers to this because I think it helps to understand just how widespread this was. Before the Black Death struck England in the year 1347, records from the village of Brigstock in Northamptonshire show that more than 300 women in that single community were brewing ale for sale. 300 women in one village. About 1/3 of all the women who lived on that manor were at any given time engaged in some form of commercial brewing. And Brigstock was not exceptional. This pattern appears in village after village, town after town across England and across much of northwestern Europe. Some of these women brewed occasionally whenever they had a grain surplus, whenever the household needed extra income, whenever circumstances allowed. Others were more permanent. There was a woman named Emma Kempster of Brigstock, whose name appears in the records without any mention of a husband, suggesting she was single, and brewing was her primary source of income. There was Maud London of Oxford, who appears in 14th century records as an established brewer in the city, operating with enough consistency to have her name preserved in the official documents. There was Marjorie de Brundle of Norwich, who brewed in the 14th and 15th centuries, and whose records show a sustained professional operation. These were not women dabbling at the edges of the economy. These were working women with working businesses, and here is the part that I find genuinely fascinating about the economics of it. The income from brewing was typically classified as supplementary to the household. The husband's work provided the main income, and the wife's brewing added to it. But think about what that actually means. It means the woman was managing money that moved through her hands directly. She purchased grain, she judged quality, she set prices, she negotiated with buyers, she made the daily decisions about when to brew, how much to brew, whom to sell to, and what to charge. And in a world where women were legally invisible, where every coin in the house theoretically belonged to her husband, brewing created a space of practical financial autonomy that the law could not quite reach. Because here is the thing about the daily grain purchase, the exchange at the door, the coin dropped into a palm at the market. Nobody wrote it down. There was no ledger that said wife of Thomas sold 6 pints, received 3 pennies. It happened. The money changed hands, and it entered the household economy in the way that everything in the household economy operated through the woman who managed it. Now I have to tell you about the dark turn in this story, because brewing did not stay a woman's world, and the way it was taken from them is one of the more infuriating episodes in medieval economic history. By the mid-14th century, something had changed. The Black Death had swept through England, killing between 1/3 and half of the population in just a few terrible years. The labour shortage that followed meant that wages rose, standards of living improved, and people had more money to spend on ale than they had ever had before. Ale went from being a homely domestic product to being a genuinely lucrative commercial opportunity. And as soon as it became truly profitable, as soon as there was real money to be made at scale, men started paying attention. Guilds formed, regulations multiplied. The equipment required for commercial-scale brewing grew more expensive. Introduction of hopped beer from the Netherlands added a whole new layer of capital cost, because hops, unlike the traditional herbs used in ale, required significant investment in cultivation and storage. Women who typically had less access to capital could not easily follow the industry as it scaled up, and so they were left behind. But it was not just economics that pushed them out, it was reputation. And this is where the story gets genuinely dark and more complicated than most popular accounts acknowledge. As brewing became dominated by male guilds, those same guilds had every incentive to undermine their female competitors. The campaign was remarkably effective. Alewives, women who had been essential community providers for centuries, began appearing in church murals and popular literature as figures of mockery and moral condemnation. In more depictions of the damned in medieval English churches than almost any other profession, you will find alewives portrayed as being dragged to hell. Not murderers, not thieves, women who sold ale. They were accused of watering down their product, of charging unfair prices, of using their knowledge of herbs and fermentation for nefarious purposes, of leading men astray with drink. Here is the bitter irony: a record from Oxford in the year 1324 actually shows that brewing offences were committed at roughly equal rates by men and women. But it was women who were dragged in the morality literature. It was women whose names became synonymous with deception. And by the year 1540, the city of Chester had passed a law banning women between the ages of 14 and 40 from selling ale altogether. The stated reason was to prevent the use of sexual desirability to spread immorality. Let that sit for a moment. They banned women from working in the trade they had invented and sustained for centuries, because men had decided they were a danger. Now you may have heard the theory, it floats around the internet with great enthusiasm, that the image of the witch in the pointed hat comes directly from the medieval alewife. The tall pointed hat she wore to be seen in crowded markets, the cauldron she brewed in, the cat she kept to protect her grain stores from mice, the broomstick hung outside her door to signal that ale was ready for sale. It is a deeply satisfying theory. It is also, I should tell you honestly, contested by historians. Scholars like Christina Wade and others who specialize in this period have pointed out that the pointy hat associated with witches in popular imagery actually appears in children's chapbooks from the late 17th and early 18th centuries, long after the medieval period. The connection between witches and cats comes from associations with heresy that predate any links to alewives. The broom riding image is ancient and found across many cultures with no particular tie to domestic brewing. So is the story clean and simple? Number history rarely is, but here is what is undeniably true. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as women were being pushed out of brewing, alewives did appear in church art and popular literature as moral villains. They were depicted in murals on church walls as sinners bound for hell. They were written about in satire as dishonest, immodest, and dangerous. Their knowledge of herbal fermentation was treated with suspicion. Their independence, their financial independence specifically, was understood as a threat. And whether or not the witch's hat came directly from the alewife's hat, the campaign to associate financially independent women with moral corruption followed a pattern we see again and again across this period. When women earn money, someone calls them dangerous. That is not my cynicism. That is medieval history. Let me tell you about what the ale trade actually looked like from the outside, because it is worth imagining in full detail. In the towns and villages of medieval England, when a brewster had a batch ready for sale, she would hang an ale stake outside her door. This was a long pole, often topped with a sheaf of wheat, or a bundle of evergreen visible from the street signalling to anyone who passed the ale is ready. Come in. On market days, some alewives carried their wares out into the crowd, and to be seen above the heads of the throng they wore tall, distinctive hats. This much at least we can say for certain. These women were not hiding, they were marketing, they were advertising. They were using every available visual signal to attract customers in a world without printed signs or storefronts. And inside there was warmth. There was the smell of grain and wood smoke. There might be a bench to sit on. There was ale, and there was woven into every transaction the quiet reality that the woman pouring the ale had made it herself, priced it herself, and was keeping track of every penny that crossed her palm. That is not nothing. That is in many ways everything. Does something about this story feel familiar to you? Think about it. A woman finds a gap in the economy, a basic need that is not being met at scale. She steps into that gap using skills she already has, resources already available to her. She builds something modest, practical, independent. And then when what she has built becomes visibly valuable, someone with more legal standing, more access to capital, more institutional power decides they want it, and takes it. I'm not going to pretend that story is uniquely medieval. We all know it is not. But here is what I want you to carry forward from tonight's brewing story. Even as the ale trade was being pulled away from women, even as the regulations multiplied and the guilds closed their doors, and the morality campaigns gained momentum, women did not simply disappear from the economy. They adapted. They found the next gap, the next necessity that nobody had quite organized yet, the next space where a woman with practical knowledge and careful attention could build something small and sustaining and real. And in the next chapter of tonight's story, we are going to find one of the most extraordinary examples of that adaptation. It involves widowhood and power, and the specific remarkable truth that for many women in the Middle Ages, the death of a husband was not a catastrophe. It was the beginning of the most financially consequential chapter of their lives. Something happens the moment a medieval woman's husband died. Not grief, though. Grief was there, of course. Something more structural, something legal. In the space of a single morning before the burial arrangements were even made, before the children had stopped crying, before the household had figured out what to do next. The woman standing in the centre of all that loss had for the first time in possibly decades become a legal person again. She had a name at law. She could sign a contract. She could appear in court in her own right. She could own land, manage property, take on debts, hire staff, and conduct business transactions without a male guardian's signature at the bottom of every document. The law called this status femme sole. And for many women in the Middle Ages, widowhood was the only time in their entire adult lives they ever held it. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it is easy to read past it. Imagine spending 10, 15, 20 years of your working life invisible under the law, managing a household of perhaps a dozen people, making daily decisions about food finances, livestock crops, servants' trade, building genuine expertise in whatever business your family ran, and then through the simple biological fact of outliving your husband watching the law, suddenly catch up to what you already were, capable, informed, ready. That is the story of the medieval widow, and it is far more complicated and far more extraordinary than history has generally given it credit for. Let me start with what the law actually granted. We talked in our earlier section about dower rights, the widow's legal entitlement to 1/3 of her late husband's estate for the rest of her life. But femme sole status went beyond property. Under English common law, by the late 14th century, a widow could appear in court and argue her own cases. She could hire attorneys and direct legal proceedings. She could negotiate contracts, take on business debt in her own name. and be held legally liable for her own financial decisions separate from any future husband she might choose to take. She could manage apprentices her husband had taken on and continue his trade. She could, in cities like London, Bath, Bristol and Lincoln, even register formally as a sole trader, able to do business with full legal standing. And critically, she could choose not to remarry. That last one sounds almost unremarkably simple, but in a world where women's legal and financial existence depended on their relationship to a man first, their father, then their husband, the ability to simply not attach yourself to a new man was one of the most radical choices available. Now, I want to be honest with you here because this story deserves honesty. Widowhood was not automatically liberating. Not for everyone. For poor widows, women without land, without savings, without a trade, widowhood often meant vulnerability, poverty, and very real pressure to remarry as quickly as possible simply to survive. Even for wealthier widows, the road was far from smooth. Feudal lords had significant financial interest in controlling the remarriage of their vassals' widows. A wealthy widow, after all, was an asset. Her land could strengthen an ally or empower a rival depending on whom she married next. Medieval records are full of cases where lords pressured widows into marriages they did not want. And there are equally remarkable records of widows who paid sometimes enormous sums to purchase their legal right to remain unmarried. In some documented cases, a widow had to formally petition and pay a fee simply to be left alone. Let that land for a second. She had to buy her own singleness. And yet here is the thing that keeps pulling me back to this history: enough of them did it. Enough women paid what was needed, fought what had to be fought, navigated whatever legal maze stood between them and their independence, that the records of medieval London alone are full of their names and their transactions. And what did they do with that independence? Let me tell you about a woman whose story was hidden in Italian banking ledgers for over 600 years, and only recently brought fully to light. Her name was Annabel Ferner. She was a grocer's widow in 15th century London. Now, and this is important, when I say grocer, I do not mean someone who ran a corner shop selling vegetables. In medieval London, a grocer were a wholesale merchant, a member of the commercial elite. Grocers imported bulk commodities from across Europe and the Mediterranean, spices, dried fruits, luxury goods, and distributed them throughout England. These were people with international networks, sophisticated financial instruments, and significant capital at their disposal. Annabel's husband had been one of them, and when he died, she stepped into the centre of that world without missing a step. The evidence for this comes from the digitized records of the Borromey Bank, a Milanese banking house that maintained offices in London in the 1430s, now preserved and studied by researchers at Queen Mary University of London. When the Italian clerks wrote Annabel's name in their ledgers, they rendered it as Fauna or Forneria, the way Italian speakers try to phonetically capture unfamiliar English names. But she was there, and what she was doing was remarkable. In the year 1437, while King James I of Scotland was being murdered and Europe descended into political upheaval, Annabel Ferner was conducting a single saffron transaction worth £38 sterling. To put that in context for you, a skilled craftsman in England during the 1430s and 40s earned roughly £5 or £6 per year. £38 represented 6 to 8 years of a skilled craftsman's wages in a single transaction, on a commodity saffron that was worth more than its weight in silver produced by harvesting the stigmas of approximately 150 individual flowers to make just one single gram. She was also trading cotton at significant scale. She was negotiating directly with Italian bankers who operated across London, Bruges, Venice, and the full sweep of the Mediterranean financial network. She was by any reasonable definition running an international wholesale trading empire from widowhood, and for 600 years her name sat in those ledgers translated into Italian phonetics waiting for someone to come looking. Annabel is remarkable, but she was not alone. When researchers look at the historical records of wool merchants in England from the year 1274, they find women listed among the greatest wool merchants in London. Women like Alice de Morsford, Marjorie Russell of Coventry, Rose de Burford. These are names that appear in official rolls, the documentation of major commercial operations as women conducting large-scale trade on their own authority. At least one woman from this period is documented as a merchant of the staple, meaning she was an officially recognised exporter of English wool to Calais, one of the most prestigious and profitable trade designations available in medieval England. These were not exceptional cases of women sneaking past the law. These were cases of women operating within the available legal frameworks with full commercial legitimacy. The framework was narrow. It required widowhood in most cases. It excluded women from full guild membership, from voting rights within trade organisations, from the highest levels of institutional power. But within those constraints, capable women built real, documented, substantial commercial lives. Now I want to ask you something, because I think this question is worth sitting with tonight. Why do we not know these names the way we know the names of their male counterparts? Part of the answer is simply how records were kept. In guild registries, in official documents, in the formal ledgers of most medieval institutions, the default language assumed maleness. Women appeared as wives of widows, of daughters, of... Even when they were conducting business in their own right, the recording systems were not designed to preserve their identities cleanly. Part of the answer is how history was subsequently written by scholars who were for most of history also mostly male, and who were looking for particular kinds of stories in particular kinds of places. And part of the answer, the part I find hardest to sit with, is that the erasure was sometimes deliberate. As the historian's work on London's medieval commercial world has shown, as guilds became more restrictive over time, as record-keeping changed, as institutional memory shifted, the earlier participation of women was slowly written out. The rules changed. The records reflected the new rules. And the women who had been there before the rules changed quietly vanished from the official story. But let me tell you about the widows who fought back against erasure in real time. In the 13th century, when the Magna Carta was issued in 1215, one of its provisions specifically addressed widows' rights, stating that a widow should have her dower and inheritance without difficulty, and that no one should be compelled to remarry while wishing to live without a husband. That this had to be codified in the foundational legal document of England tells you how regularly it was being violated, and the records from the courts of the 13th and 14th centuries are full of widows pursuing those rights through formal legal proceedings. Widows suing sons who had taken their dower lands. Widows suing stepsons who refused to hand over what the law guaranteed. Widows suing in-laws, lords, neighbours, anyone who had tried to step into the vacuum of a husband's death and help themselves to what was legally hers. Some of these women fought those cases for years, for decades. There is the case of Sybil de Fulthorpe, whose husband died in exile in 1394. She spent the better part of the next 20 years pursuing her legal rights through the courts, fighting at the York Assizes from the year 1403 until 1410, simply to recover a single manor that had been seized from her control by local families. 20 years of legal fighting, not because she was exceptional in her stubbornness, but because this was for many widows simply what was required to hold on to what was legally theirs. The law gave it to them on paper. Reality required something considerably more. And here is a thread I want to pull on because I think it reveals something important about how medieval society actually processed the idea of a financially independent woman. The medieval widow was in her culture a figure that generated profound ambivalence. On one hand, the widow was sympathetic, moralized about in sermons protected theoretically by law associated in religious imagery with piety and vulnerability. On the other hand, the medieval widow was suspicious. She was a woman operating in the public sphere, making decisions without a husband's direction, appearing in courts, signing contracts, managing people and property, doing in other words things that the prevailing social order had assigned exclusively to men. The medieval figure of the merry widow, the woman who enjoyed her independence perhaps a little too much, who was perhaps not quite as grief-stricken as convention expected, appears in literature from Chaucer onwards. It is telling that this figure exists at all, because what it suggests is that the society around these women could sense that something had shifted, that the rules that ordinarily applied did not quite apply here, and that she knew it. Chaucer's wife of Bath, one of the most famous characters in all of English medieval literature, is specifically a widow who survived 5 husbands and who speaks with complete and unflinching authority about money, marriage, property, and power. She is funny, she is formidable, and she is underneath everything a portrait of what medieval society both admired and feared in the independent woman: the financial knowledge, the refusal to pretend it did not exist. There is one more dimension to this story that I want to bring in before we move on, because it changes the emotional texture of everything we have been talking about. Not every widow who chose to remain unmarried did so because she had wealth and wanted to protect it. Some did. But others chose it for something harder to quantify, something that rarely made it into the official record. In the accounts of widows who petitioned to avoid remarriage in the letters and wills and court documents that have survived, there are sometimes glimpses of women who had simply decided that the life they had built during widowhood, the decisions they were making, the property they were managing, the daily sense of being the person responsible for their own choices, was worth protecting. Not because they were unhappy in their marriages, some of them appear to have been, but because they had tasted something specific and they were unwilling to give it back. The historian Joel Rosenthal, writing about widows in 15th century England, described widowhood for some women as a gateway of opportunity, a moment when real alternatives appeared for the first time. That phrase stays with me, a gateway of opportunity, opened by death, which is perhaps the most quietly devastating thing you can say about what medieval law offered women. The door opened, but only one key unlocked it. So widowhood in all its complexity, its grief, its legal battles, its unexpected power, its ambivalence, its documented commercial triumphs, stands as one of the most important financial realities for medieval women. But notice what connects every story we've told tonight. The alewife in her kitchen, the merchant widow at her ledger, the noblewoman fighting her stepson in court for her dower land. Each of them was working within a system that had not been designed for her. Each of them was finding the narrow spaces where the rules allowed movement and moving. Each of them was accumulating knowledge about law, about trade, about money, about the specific leverage points that the system offered to people in their position, and they shared that knowledge, not always in writing, but in practice, in the household routines passed from mother to daughter, in the guild traditions where a widow took on her husband's apprentices and quietly taught them while also teaching herself, in the networks of women who knew the same merchants, the same lawyers, the same local officials, and who understood without needing to say it aloud exactly how the game was played, because there were women who operated at an even higher level of institutional sophistication, women who managed entire estates not for themselves but in the name of absent husbands and young sons, and who in doing so quietly became some of the most skilled administrators of the medieval world. Women who ran the equivalent of modern multinational operations from the account books of great houses while remaining officially in the background. That is the world we enter next. Imagine for a moment that you have just read a ledger. Not a romantic document, not a love letter or a battle plan or a royal proclamation, A ledger, column after column of expenditures written out in careful Latin, recording the daily movement of grain and wine and firewood and wages across a large Suffolk estate in the year 1412. You might expect that kind of document to feel like a rather dry academic curiosity, but what you actually feel when you understand whose ledger it was and how she came to keep it is something closer to awe. Because the woman behind those columns was managing over 6,000 acres of land, numerous farms properties in the City of London, a household of staff ranging from chaplains and squires to cooks and rabbit hunters, a constant stream of visiting nobility and clergy who needed to be housed and fed legal proceedings with the royal court itself and the financial affairs of multiple wardships placed in her care by the Crown. And she did it alone for 49 years. Her name was Alice de Brine, and she is just one of many women this story belongs to. So let me build the world she lived in because it matters enormously to understanding how these women operated. The medieval noble estate was not a home. It was an enterprise, a working farm, a judicial court, a provisioning network, a labour management system, a credit operation and an accommodation facility all at once. At any given time, a large noble estate might employ dozens of permanent staff, stewards, chamberlains, chaplains, valets, cooks, huntsmen, grooms, with hundreds more hired on seasonally during harvest or construction. Every single one of those people needed to be paid, fed, housed, managed. Disputes among tenants needed to be heard and resolved. Rents from tenant farmers needed to be collected and recorded. Supplies needed to be purchased at the right prices and stored properly. Accounts needed to be audited regularly to check that stewards and bailiffs were not quietly helping themselves to the household funds, which the historical record suggests happened with some frequency. And all of this needed to happen whether the lord of the estate was present or not. Which leads us to a reality that medieval history has massively underappreciated. Medieval lords were by the nature of their world frequently absent, gone on crusade, gone to war, gone to court in London or Paris, gone on pilgrimage, gone for months or years at a time, and when they were gone somebody had to run the operation. That somebody was almost invariably their wife. Think about what that actually required. Not the ceremonial version, the gracious hostess gliding through tapestried rooms. The real version. A noblewoman managing a large estate in her husband's absence was by any modern analogy the chief executive officer of a multi-million-pound corporation, without a formal title, without legal recognition of her authority in most contexts, and without any of the institutional support that her husband took for granted. She had to know agricultural yields and how to evaluate them. She had to understand the credit relationships the estate had with merchants and money lenders and how to maintain them. She had to be able to read legal documents sufficiently to protect the estate's interests in disputes, or if she could not read them herself, to cultivate relationships with men who could. She had to know enough about the cost of provisions, grain, wine, firewood, candles, meat, fish to recognize when her steward was overcharging her. She had to manage the social obligations of hospitality with what was essentially a corporate entertainment budget. And she had to do all of this while remaining in law her husband's dependent. The accounts say one thing, the law said another. Reality, as is so often the case, sided with the accounts. Let me put some real flesh on this with Alice de Brienne. Alice was born around 1360 and widowed in 1386 when her husband Sir Guy died. Through inheritance, her own strategic marriage, and crucially 49 years of careful management, she built landholdings that exceeded 6,000 acres. Most of those acres were in East Anglia, but she also had farms in Western England and properties in the City of London. The income they generated was in the hundreds of pounds per year, placing her comfortably in the wealthy gentry, though not among the very highest nobility. What makes Alice extraordinary What makes her one of the most studied noblewomen in medieval English history is the survival of her household book, specifically the accounts covering the period from September of 1412 to September of 1413, a single year of meticulous records. And what those records reveal is staggering in their detail. The household book tracks every significant expenditure across that year, down to the last pigeon served at table, the last herring purchased for a fish day meal. It records the wages of her permanent staff, the costs of seasonal labour, the provisions bought, and at what prices. It tracks who visited the estate and was fed there, and the scale of her hospitality reveals that the guest list included on significant feast days more than 100 people. On Christmas Day alone, Alice's household fed approximately 300 people. That is not a family dinner. That is a logistics operation requiring procurement, storage, advanced planning, kitchen management, and careful financial control, executed by a woman whom the law still classified as her dead husband's dependent. The accounting precision of that household book has led historians to study it as a source document on medieval prices, labour practices, and provisioning networks. And it is all because Alice de Brigne wrote everything down. Now, Alice was doing this in her own right as a widow, but the pattern she exemplified, the careful accounting, the estate oversight, the tenant management, the financial control, were things that noble women were expected to have mastered long before they were ever widowed, because the apprenticeship came first. From the moment a noble woman arrived in her husband's household as a young bride, she was already learning the operation she would eventually run, either alongside him or in his absence. She watched the steward's reports. She managed the day-to-day procurement. She kept track of what came in and what went out. The 13th century bishop Robert Grosseteste wrote a treatise specifically for Margaret de Lacy, Countess of Lincoln, advising her on how to manage her estates and household. His 16th rule on household management addressed something as precise as what clothing her servants should wear at table, not because clothing was the point, but because the point was that every detail of the operation reflected on her authority and competence. You did not get to be casual. You did not get to leave things to chance. If the estate was to function, you had to understand all of it, all of the time. Christina de Pisan, a writer we will return to at length in a later part of this series, wrote explicitly about this expectation in her guides for noble women. She argued that a noble woman whose husband was travelling at court or fighting in a war should, as a matter of honour, familiarise herself with all aspects of estate management, including the accounts. Not because it was an interesting optional extra, but because it was a duty, and because neglecting it would put creditors in the position of having to chase what they were owed. The language of duty and honour was doing interesting work here. It was giving women explicit permission to exercise financial authority that the law simultaneously denied them. And here I want to offer you a thought that I keep returning to when I work through this history. There is a profound irony at the heart of the medieval noblewoman situation. The same legal system that made her financially invisible during her marriage, that erased her personhood under coverture, that transferred her property and her legal identity to her husband, on the day of her wedding, simultaneously created a world in which that husband's practical competence depended on her running everything while he was away. He could not go on crusade without her. He could not go to court in London for months at a time without her. He could not conduct his public life, his military service, his political obligations, his patronage networks, without the certainty that she was home managing the infrastructure that made all of it possible. And she could not be legally recognised for doing it. The history of medieval estate management is in a very real sense the history of what happens when you make half of the operational workforce invisible and then entirely depend on it. Let me bring in one more dimension of this story because I think it changes how we see these women. The Countess of Leicester in the year 1265 travelled to Dover Castle with a baggage train that required more than 140 horses to carry it. 140 horses. That is not a woman arriving at a holiday cottage. That is a woman arriving at a major household with full operational capacity, staff, supplies, equipment, everything needed to establish and run a functioning noble estate from the moment she got through the gates. The logistics of moving a medieval noble household were themselves a significant undertaking requiring advanced planning, provisioning contracts, coordination with dozens of people, and a clear financial budget for the journey. And all of that planning and coordination was typically the responsibility of the noblewoman at the centre of it. She was, in contemporary business language, both the chief executive officer and the chief operating officer, the strategic planner and the operations manager, running an organisation of dozens of permanent employees and hundreds of seasonal and visiting ones with no email, no telephone, no modern record-keeping software, and no legal standing to enforce her own authority in a court of law. Does that strike you as remarkable? It strikes me as remarkable every time I think about it. There is something else worth noting about this pattern of estate management, and it is something that historians have only relatively recently started paying attention to. The skills that noblewomen developed running estates in their husbands' absences were not lost when the husbands came back. They were retained, and they were passed on. A noblewoman who had spent 2 years managing a complex agricultural estate while her husband was in France did not forget how to read a bailiff's accounts when he came home. A woman who had negotiated a wool sale or resolved a tenant dispute or managed a significant building project did not unlearn those skills. She carried them. And she taught them to daughters-in-law, to the young women placed in her household as part of their own education. The great noble household was not just an economic operation, it was a training institution. Women teaching women how to manage the complex financial and administrative machinery of medieval landed society, without formal acknowledgement, without institutional title, but with remarkable effectiveness. We should also be honest about the limits of this picture because the full truth matters. Not every noblewoman ran her estates with the precision of Alice de Brienne. Not every woman had the literacy, the temperament, the access to good advisors, or the family support to navigate the complexities of medieval estate management successfully. There are records of estates falling into debt during husbands' absences. There are records of women being cheated by dishonest stewards they could not adequately monitor. There are records of women who struggled, who failed, who lost ground they could not recover. The existence of remarkable women does not erase the difficulty of the ordinary circumstances. But here is what I think matters most about the women who did manage well. They built something that outlasted their individual circumstances. Alice de Brienne's household book survives because she kept good records. Those records survive because someone after her understood their value and preserved them. And today historians can reconstruct the daily economic life of a 15th century Suffolk estate because one woman in her manor at Acton wrote down everything from the price of a herring to the wage of a rabbit hunter. That is what careful accounting looks like across 6 centuries. That is what the financial discipline of a medieval noblewoman looks like from 700 years away. And here I want to pause and let that settle for just a moment. We have been talking across this entire series about women who kept financial records sometimes in hidden places, sometimes in legal documents, sometimes in the stitching of their daily work. The alewife with her mental arithmetic, the widow with her contract, the noblewoman with her household book. What they have in common is not just gender. What they have in common is the stubborn insistence on keeping track, on knowing what was coming in and what was going out, on making the invisible visible at least to themselves. And the reason that matters to us sitting here so many centuries later is that their records are sometimes the only evidence we have that they existed at all. The women who kept no records, and there were far more of them, left nothing for history to find. Which means that what has survived is in a real sense the financial record of women's determination to be counted, and yet there is a world of medieval women's financial life that operated even further from official view than estate management. Women who found their financial power not in land or ledgers or guild memberships, but in thread, in cloth, in the quiet parallel economy of textile production that ran through every level of medieval society, from the grandest wool merchant to the humblest spinster in her cottage, and that constituted for centuries the most widespread form of informal female wealth in the medieval world. That story is made of silk and linen and dye and sweat, and it is waiting for us just ahead. Thread. That is where we begin this time. Not a ledger, not a courtroom, not a market stall. A single thread pulled from a ball of raw wool between a woman's fingers, twisted and drawn out, twisted again, wound onto a weighted spindle that drops and spins below her hand as she walks. She is walking because she's always doing something else at the same time, tending chickens, carrying a basket, moving between the garden and the house. Medieval women spun everywhere all the time because the demand for thread was simply that enormous. Consider this: to weave just 1 yard of cloth a single square yard, you needed roughly 900 yards of warp thread and another 900 yards of weft. 1,800 yards of hand-spun thread for 1 yard of cloth, and people needed cloth for clothing, for bedding, for bags, for sails, for bandages, for church vestments, for every woven thing in the world. The distaff, that long rod a woman tucked through her belt to hold the raw wool fibre as she spun, became so associated with female identity that it gave the English language 2 expressions still in use today. A woman who had not yet married was called a spinster. The maternal line of a family was called the distaff side. Both expressions began as straightforward descriptions of what women did. Both eventually became something more loaded with expectation, with limitation, with a quiet message about where a woman belonged. But before they became limitations, they were descriptions of an economy. And that economy was enormous. Let me give you the scale of what we are actually talking about. In medieval Flanders, the great cloth-producing region of what is now Belgium, historians have calculated that the most labour-intensive stage of cloth production was not the weaving, it was the spinning. Spinning consumed approximately 503 hours of labour for every piece of finished cloth. 503 hours. Weaving, by comparison, took a fraction of that. This means that the invisible domestic female-associated work of spinning represented the single largest investment of labour in the entire cloth industry, and the entire cloth industry in late medieval Europe was one of the largest economic sectors in existence. In the city of Ghent alone, a major Flemish cloth-producing city, records from the year 1356 list approximately 5,130 weavers out of a total urban population of around 64,000 people. 5,000 weavers. And behind each of those weavers spinning the thread they needed was an army of women. Women working in their homes. Women working for piece rates paid in cash or cloth. Women operating in a parallel economic system that ran beneath the official guild structures of medieval trade because those guild structures by and large did not admit them. Here is the central tension at the heart of medieval women's textile work, and I want to make sure we really feel it. The cloth industry was one of the main engines of medieval economic growth. It built the great cloth halls of Bruges and Ghent. It financed the Renaissance in Florence, the paintings, the sculptures, the architecture, all of it funded in significant part by wool and silk money. The English wool trade was so central to royal finance that the Lord Chancellor of England still sits on the woolsack to this day, a ceremonial seat stuffed with wool placed there by Edward III in the 14th century as a reminder of where England's wealth came from. And the most labour-intensive foundation of all of this, the spinning, the carding, the combing, the preparatory work that made everything else possible, was almost entirely done by women, who were almost entirely excluded from the formal institutions that governed, regulated, and profited from the trade. The guilds, the merchant companies, the civic structures that organised production and divided its rewards. Women could spin for the guild system. They could not in most places vote in it, govern it, own a workshop through it, or pass their trade credentials through it in the same way men could. They produced the thread that made the cloth that built the cities, and the cities were largely built for men. That is not a footnote to medieval economic history. That is the central story. But here is what I find most interesting and why I spend so much time with this material. Women did not simply accept the official story. They built around it. They created parallel structures of knowledge transfer, economic cooperation, and informal market participation that operated alongside and sometimes in direct competition with the official guild world. The clearest example of this comes from Paris in the 13th and 14th centuries. The historian Sharon Farmer, in her detailed study of the medieval Parisian silk industry, found that in the 13th and 14th centuries, women outnumbered men among Parisian silk workers, not by a little, by a considerable margin. Out of 241 women listed on tax rolls with an identified profession in this period, 26% were working in silk. The city of Paris at this time had 7 guilds that were either exclusively female or female-dominated in the luxury silk production sector alone. 7. In late 13th century Paris, the women who spun raw silk into thread, who wove narrow silk goods like ribbons and cords and decorative bands, and who organised the networks that distributed those goods to the aristocratic households and religious institutions that consumed them, these women constituted a significant, formally recognised economic force. Not a marginal one, not a hidden one, a recognised, taxed, guild-organised force. Now I want to tell you about the silk women of London, because their story is one I keep coming back to, and it illustrates something so perfectly about how women navigated the official economy that I think it deserves its own space. In the 15th century, the silk trade of London was dominated by women, not in the spinning stages alone, but in the skilled work of turning raw silk imported from Italy into finished goods. The ribbons, the braids, the cords, the girdles, the decorative fringes used on clothing, on sword hangings, on the seals of official charters. These were called the silk women, or in the language of the time, the silker women. Their work was classified as a mystery, a body of specialised knowledge passed from mistress to apprentice, exactly as any male guild operated. They trained young women. They maintained quality standards. They cultivated relationships with the royal court, supplying silk goods directly to queens and their households. One silk woman named Emmet Norton, working around the year 1420, was supplying silk thread, cord, gilt, silk ribbons and metal fittings directly to Joan of Navarre, the queen consort of King Henry IV, even while the queen was being held prisoner at Leeds Castle. Another enclaver who died in 1489 was the personal silk woman to King Edward IV. She supplied him with embroidery thread ribbons, a mantle of blue silk lace silk fringes in yellow, green, red, white, and blue, and bed coverings with imagery, scripture, and decorative patterns. She made tufts of silk to decorate the coronation gloves of King Richard III. She made buttons for the robes worn at his coronation, alongside those of his queen Anne Neville. This woman dressed a king and queen for their most important public moment. And she ran her business, her skilled, specialised royal warrant business, from 15th century London as an independent silk woman. And now the part that stops me cold every time I think about it. In the year 1455, the silk women of London did something that was for their time and context extraordinary. They petitioned Parliament, not as individuals, collectively. They went to the Parliament of King Henry VI and argued in formal legal language that Italian merchants, specifically the Lombards, were flooding the English market with inferior imported silk goods cheaply and deceitfully made, and that this was destroying their livelihood. They described their trade as the virtuous labour of gentlewomen. They asked Parliament to protect them, and Parliament passed the Importation Act of 1455 prohibiting the importation of the goods they had identified, with punishments of forfeiture and significant fines. The silkwomen of London, who did not have a guild, who had no formal institutional standing, who operated in the grey legal zone between the domestic sphere and the public trade world, successfully lobbied the national legislature of England, and won. Between 1455 and 1504 they petitioned Parliament multiple times, securing a series of temporary embargoes against foreign silk goods. Can I ask you something? When you think about women's political and economic power in the Middle Ages, does this fit the picture you had? I suspect for most people it does not, and I think that is because we have been taught through the selective survival of records, through the emphasis historians placed for a long time on guild structures and official documents, to see the official world as the real world. But the silkwomen of London are a reminder that the real world included people who operated outside the official categories, who built their own structures, who took their case to the highest available authority, and who for a while at least got what they asked for. There is a tragic postscript to the silkwomen story, and I feel I owe it to you. Despite their successful parliamentary petitions, despite their royal connections, despite the quality and skill of their work. As the 16th century progressed, men moved into the silk trade in London, and when men moved in, they did what men who entered formerly female-dominated trades had done before them. They formed a guild. They used the guild to impose formal structures that excluded women. They took over. The pattern was deeply familiar by this point. We saw it with brewing. We will see it again and again as we move through this history. A trade is female-dominated when it is low status or not yet commercially significant. When it becomes profitable enough to attract male attention, men enter, formalize and reorganize it, and women are gradually pushed to the margins or pushed out entirely. The historian Judith Bennett documented this pattern so thoroughly in her work on medieval brewing that it became a cornerstone of how we understand the relationship between gender and economic change in the pre-modern world. It is not a coincidence, it is a mechanism, and it operated with such consistency across so many trades and centuries that calling it a pattern understates what it was. It was a system, but let me leave you with something that complicates that story just slightly. Because the full picture of women's textile work in the Middle Ages was not only one of exclusion and displacement, it was also one of extraordinary persistent adaptive resilience. Women who could not organize as a guild organized as informal networks. Women who could not own a workshop in their own legal name worked through family structures that gave them practical control without formal recognition. Women who were pushed out of one trade found entry points in adjacent ones. And at every level of the textile economy, from the grandest silk merchant supplying the royal court to the peasant woman spinning beside her fire, there was continuous, largely invisible, largely unacknowledged flow of female labour, female knowledge, and female financial calculation that kept the entire system moving. The spinning wheel, which first appeared in Europe in the 13th century, increased the speed of spinning significantly, and according to some historical analyses, the productivity gain it gave women was large enough that for a period, women used that leverage to demand formal recognition and economic concessions. In some regions, as their productivity increased with the new technology, they were granted the right to form their own craft guilds, to control the quality and price of their product, to build something institutional, It did not always last, but it happened, which is perhaps the most honest summary of medieval women's textile economy you can offer. It happened, and then it was taken, and then they found another way, and then it happened again. Now there is one more place in medieval society where women built something institutional, something lasting, something that operated by entirely different rules from the guild world, the merchant world, and the estate management world we've been exploring. A place where women controlled land, ran financial operations, extended credit, and accumulated power, in some cases enormous power, with the full formal blessing of the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, the church, and the building that made it possible was the convent. What happened inside those walls, what the abbesses who ran them were actually doing, financially speaking, and how families across medieval Europe used the convent as one of the most sophisticated financial instruments available to them, is a story that is considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than you might expect. Right at the end of the last part, I left you with a promise, and I want to keep it now. The church, more specifically the building, the walls, the thick stone walls of the medieval convent which so many of us picture as a place of retreat from the world, a place of simplicity and prayer and quiet obedience. I want to gently suggest that this image, while not entirely wrong, is missing something rather significant. Because behind those walls in the right abbeys, and in the hands of the right women, something else was happening entirely. Something that looked less like withdrawal from the world and rather more like a masterclass in holding power within it. Let me give you a number and I want you to sit with it for a moment. There is a saying, a genuine medieval saying documented by the historian Bishop Thomas Fuller, that circulated in England during the later Middle Ages. It went like this: if the Abbot of Glastonbury could marry the Abbess of Shaftesbury, their heir would hold more land than the King of England. Read that again if you need to. The heir of the Abbess of Shaftesbury, a woman the head of a nunnery, and the Abbot of Glastonbury, a man the head of one of England's wealthiest monasteries, combined their land holdings would have exceeded those of the Crown. Not matched them, exceeded them. Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset was founded in the year 888 by King Alfred the Great, who installed his own daughter Ethelgifu as its first abbess. By the time of the Norman Domesday Survey in 1086, the abbey held lands across Dorset, Wiltshire, Somerset and Sussex, hundreds of hides of agricultural land-town properties and pasture. By the 12th century, the Abbess of Shaftesbury held lands assessed at the military service of 7 knights, meaning she was legally responsible for providing 7 armed knights to the king's army, in the same way any male lord of comparable holdings would have been. She was, in the precise technical language of medieval feudalism, a lord. She held court, she managed tenants, she had a steward who by the year 1340 was officiating the swearing-in of the town's mayor. The mayor of the town swore his oath before a representative of the abbess, at a nunnery, in the Middle Ages. Can I ask you something? Does this fit the picture you were taught in school? Because I think for most people it absolutely does not. Now I want to be honest with you, as I always try to be when we explore this history together. Shaftesbury was exceptional. It was the wealthiest Benedictine nunnery in all of England, and at the time of its dissolution by King Henry VIII, in 1539, it was the second wealthiest religious house of any kind. So I am not suggesting that every medieval convent was a financial empire. Many were not. Many were poor, operating on thin margins, dependent on uncertain donations, struggling to maintain their buildings and feed their communities. Eileen Power, the pioneering 20th century historian who wrote the definitive study of medieval English nunneries, documented cases of convents that were genuinely impoverished houses where the nuns were cold hungry, poorly supplied, constantly in debt. She also documented the cases we're discussing tonight, the great abbeys, the wealthy houses, the institutions that particularly between the 6th and 12th centuries operated as something very close to autonomous economic and political units within the feudal landscape. And even among the more modest houses, the structural position of the abbess, what it allowed her to do, what it protected her from what it gave her, was something that had almost no parallel for women outside the church. Let us think about this from the perspective of a medieval noble family with several daughters. This is a thought experiment I find genuinely illuminating. You're a prosperous landowner in 12th century England. You have 4 daughters. The law of coverture means that when each daughter marries, everything she brings with her, any land, any dowry, any wealth, transfers to her husband's legal control. If you want to keep wealth within your family, circulating between family networks, rather than dispersing into other men's estates, marriage is not your friend. Every marriage dowry is wealth leaving the family. If the husband mismanages, it wastes, it takes the family into debt. Your daughter has almost no legal recourse. Now, consider the alternative. The convent required a spiritual dowry, sometimes called an entry gift or a monastic dowry, to place a daughter in a religious house. This was typically substantially lower than a marriage dowry. Across medieval Europe, historians have documented that the entry cost to a convent was regularly somewhere between half and 2/3 of what a comparable marriage dowry would have cost. That alone is a significant financial calculation, but the logic goes deeper. A daughter placed in a well-connected convent, particularly a prestigious one of the kind that attracted noblewomen from influential families, was a daughter embedded in a network of exactly the kind of relationships that were valuable to a medieval aristocratic family. The convent was, as the historian Silvia Evangelisti described it, an invaluable opportunity for networking, helping families to reinforce ties within their social rank and open up paths for social mobility. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of sending a daughter to the right school, except that this particular school was also a property-holding, legally recognized church-protected institution that could hold assets, permanently, assets that, unlike a marriage dowry, could not be seized by a husband. Money placed in a convent or land holdings endowed to a convent stayed in the convent. They could not be confiscated by a feudal lord. They could not be inherited away by a son-in-law's family. They sat protected by the authority of the church itself in perpetuity. Here is where the financial architecture of the convent becomes genuinely fascinating. Because the wealth held by a well-endowed abbey was not just sitting there, it was working. Medieval abbeys, male and female, functioned as some of the most sophisticated financial institutions in pre-modern Europe. They held land. They managed agricultural production across sometimes vast estates. They collected rents. They provided loans. They accepted deposits. They issued annuities arrangements by which a donor would give a lump sum to the convent in exchange for annual payments for the rest of their life, a financial structure that was entirely legitimate under church law in a way that straightforward lending at interest was not. The convent was in many practical senses a bank, and in some cases a bank run by women. I want to tell you about a woman who understood this system better than almost anyone in her century. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen. She was born around 1098 in the Rhineland region of what is now Germany, the 10th child of a noble family. In the medieval tradition, a 10th child was often treated as a kind of spiritual gift, something to be offered back to God. Hildegard was placed with a religious community under the care of an abbess named Jutta von Sponheim at around 8 years old. She would spend essentially her entire life inside the religious world, and she became by any measure one of the most powerful women in 12th century Europe, not despite the convent, because of it. By the time Hildegard was in her late 30s, she was running her community at Disibodenberg, and then, and this is the part that I think about a great deal, she decided to found her own convent at Rupertsberg near the town of Bingen. To do this she needed land, she needed construction, she needed money, and here is how she got it. She used the dowries. The spiritual dowries that the families of her nuns had paid as entry gifts to the community at Disibodenberg Hildegard argued that this money belonged to her community, and when she moved to found the new house at Rupertsberg, she fought, genuinely fought in a documented, protracted dispute with the abbot of Disibodenberg to take those funds with her. The abbot refused. Hildegard took to her bed. She claimed with complete conviction that her illness was caused by the resistance of the monks to God's will. Whether you read that as genuine mystical experience, sophisticated political theatre, or some combination of the two, and I am inclined to think it was all three, it worked. The abbot eventually relented. The dowry funds were transferred. The new convent at Rupertsberg was built, and Hildegard, who spent much of the rest of her long life in that building, went on to correspond with 4 different popes, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Henry II of England, and his Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, and dozens of other major figures offering advice, issuing rebukes, and conducting preaching tours across Germany that were explicitly forbidden to women under church law. She did them anyway, and people came to listen. Now here is the part of this story that most history books do not tell you, and it is the part I think is most important. The convent was not only a place for women who chose religious life. For a significant portion of medieval women, entry into a convent was not primarily a spiritual decision. It was a family financial strategy. This is uncomfortable to say, and I want to say it with the care it deserves. These were real women's lives. Some were devout, some had genuine vocations. Some found in the convent a kind of freedom, intellectual, administrative, social, that was available nowhere else. Eileen Power wrote in her study of English nunneries that the convent provided an alternative to marriage for women who were unable or unwilling to marry, that it was a refuge of female intellectuals, and that it was sometimes a means of disposing of superfluous daughters. All three were true simultaneously. The word superfluous sounds harsh, but the reality behind it was a genuine economic problem. In an aristocratic family with multiple daughters, the cost of providing each one with a marriage dowry sufficient to attract a suitable husband could be crippling. In Venice, as we discussed earlier in this video, dowry inflation became so severe in the 14th century that some families faced real financial strain trying to marry even one daughter into the appropriate social tier. The convent's lower entry cost was not a secondary consideration. For many families, it was the primary one. The daughter who went to the convent was not necessarily the daughter who was unloved, or the daughter who was different, or the daughter who had somehow failed. She was often the daughter whose family had correctly calculated that placing her in a well-endowed religious house was both financially practical and, if the house was prestigious enough, socially advantageous. And for some women, a genuinely meaningful number, the calculation worked out in ways that secular life never could have offered. Because within the convent, if you were capable, and if the institution was well run, you could rise. The abbess was elected by the community of nuns. She was elected for life. She wielded absolute authority within her house. She managed the estate, oversaw the accounts, conducted correspondence with the most powerful people in her world, and in the case of the greater Besses held the equivalent of a noble lordship. The historian Joanne McNamara documented that in the period between the 6th and 10th centuries, particularly the greater Besses came from local ruling families, educated young women, preserved intellectual heritage, and were, in her precise words, intrinsic components of the new feudal ruling class. They sent troops to war, they held court, they enjoyed all the rights of noble men. That sentence comes from McNamara's research on early medieval abbesses, and every time I read it I have to stop for a moment. They sent troops to war, an abbess commanding knights in the same way any male feudal lord commanded his military obligations, because she was legally the lord. I do not want to romanticize this, and I will not. The convent could be, and sometimes was, a place of genuine suffering. Girls were placed there as children, sometimes as infants, without any say in the matter. Young women were sent there against their will when their families could not afford their marriage dowries or wanted to be rid of an inconvenient daughter. The Church's own records document cases of unhappy, unwilling nuns, women who petitioned to leave, who attempted to escape, who spent decades in a life they had never chosen. King Henry I of England and others like him sent the wives and daughters of political opponents to nunneries as a form of sophisticated imprisonment, a way of removing a woman from public life without the messiness of a more violent solution. Gwenllian, the daughter of the Welsh Prince Llewellyn, was sent to the English priory of Sempringham as a child after her father's defeat in 1283. She died there more than half a century later in 1337, having spent essentially her entire life within those walls. She never left. She had never chosen to be there. That too is part of this history. And I think it matters that we hold both things at once, the women for whom the convent was an opportunity, and the women for whom it was a cage, because the same institution was capable of being both, often at the same time. What I keep returning to when I think about the medieval convent as a financial instrument is this. The Church provided something that secular law did not. A legal structure within which a woman, or more precisely a community of women, could hold property, manage wealth, and conduct economic operations with a degree of institutional permanence and protection that was extraordinarily difficult to achieve in any other way. The secular world required a man's name on almost everything. The Church required a vow, and a vow for all its spiritual freight opened a door. The story of women's financial ingenuity in the Middle Ages has many threads. We have followed cloth through workshops and petitions to Parliament. We have followed the abbess's seal through estates and courts, and the correspondence of popes. In the next part of this story we move to the streets, away from the abbeys and the noble estates and the silk workshops, down to the market square, down to the women who had no family wealth to protect, no prestigious house to enter, no estate to manage from behind a comfortable stone wall. The women who had nothing, and who found ways to survive anyway, often right under the noses of the authorities who tried very hard to stop them. Picture a street, not a grand one, not a market square with stone arches and official stalls and licensed merchants announcing their wares to prosperous customers, a narrow street in any medieval English or French or Flemish city you care to name. Early morning before the official market opens, a woman is walking along it. She carries a basket on her arm. The basket contains eggs, or cheese, or small loaves of bread she baked before dawn, or a few pennies worth of dried fish. She's going door to door. She has no stall. She has no license. She almost certainly has no husband, or has a husband who cannot earn enough to feed their children. She has what is in the basket, and she has what I think is one of the most quietly remarkable capacities in the entire history of human economic life. She has learned to turn almost nothing into something. This woman had a name in the Middle Ages. She was called a huckster. The word huckster comes from the Middle English huck meaning to haggle. And here is a detail I want you to hold on to. The word entered the English language around 1200 with the feminine word, ending typical of occupations dominated by women huckstress. Because most hucksters were women, this was so well understood at the time that the female ending was built directly into the word itself. The word was not describing an anomaly, it was describing a norm. The huckster and her close cousin the regrater, a woman who bought goods at the official market price and resold them in smaller quantities in less regulated spaces to people who could not afford to buy in bulk, were fixtures of medieval urban life. They worked in the space between the official economy and the people who couldn't access it. And they were everywhere. Before I go further, I want to ask you something, and I really mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. What do you think survival actually looked like for a poor woman in medieval England? Not a widow of a merchant with some residual network and a little starting capital. Not a nun with the church's protection behind her. Not a noble wife managing an estate while her husband was away at war. A genuinely poor woman, alone or with a husband who was ill or absent or insufficient. With children, in a city where the guilds would not take her as an apprentice, where the major trades were organised specifically to exclude women without formal credentials or family connections, where the law of coverture meant that any husband she had technically owned her labour, where the formal market structure charged fees for stalls she couldn't afford. What did she do? She found a basket, and she started walking. The hucksters and regreters of medieval Europe appear most vividly in history, not in stories told about them, but in court records, because they were prosecuted regularly, persistently. The medieval legal system had a specific set of offences designed to regulate the food market for stalling, which meant intercepting goods before they reached the official market so you could buy them cheap. Regrating which meant buying goods at market price and reselling them at a higher price in the same market or nearby. And engrossing, which meant buying up large quantities to create artificial scarcity. All three were illegal. All three were in practice fundamental strategies of survival for women with no other options. The evidence from the Leet jurisdiction records of the city of Norwich covering the 13th and 14th centuries shows women being regularly charged with breaking the assize of ale, keeping back money from the sale of corn, and buying corn outside the city walls where taxes were not collected, either keeping it for their families or reselling it at a small profit. Women listed as bakers, poulterers and brewers in the York records of 1301 appear repeatedly as transgressors of borough ordinances. The same names appear year after year. The same small fines, the same offences. Here is the part of this that I find genuinely thought-provoking, and I have spent a lot of time with it. In the records of the manorial court at Topcliffe in Yorkshire, covering the period from 1316 to 1367, historians have counted 15 references to bread assizes, 75 references to ale assizes, and dozens of recorded fines for violations of both. The fines were typically 3 or 6 pence, rarely more than 12, and they were recurring. The same people year after year paying the same small fines for the same small violations. One particular man, Reginald Cavell, was fined 12 pence in 1316 for brewing contrary to the assize. He was fined the same amount the following year. His wife was separately fined 6 pence for the same period. They kept doing it. The court kept fining them, and they kept doing it. There is a passage in a scholarly analysis of this record that has lodged in my mind, and I want to share the idea with you even if I tell it in my own words. The interpretation is this: the recurring fines may not have been meant as deterrents at all. They may have functioned as a de facto licensing system. Pay your 6 pence. Continue selling your ale or your bread or your eggs. Pay your 6 pence again next year. The lord of the manor collected a reliable revenue stream. The woman with the basket kept her livelihood. Neither party had any real interest in a different arrangement. This is, when you think about it, a fairly sophisticated negotiated accommodation between official law and practical necessity. The official record says illegal. The practical reality says ongoing. The fine says tolerated. For the women who depended on this trade, that distinction between officially illegal and practically tolerated was the difference between eating and not eating. I want to tell you about something that appears in Piers Plowman, a major 14th century English poem by William Langland. In it, one of the allegorical characters, Avarice, the personification of greed, describes his wife, whom he calls Rose the Regrater. Langland's Avarice boasts that Rose commonly cheated her customers. She used false weights. She sold thinned ale by the cupful to poor people at the price of better ale. Now Langland intended this as a moral condemnation. Rose the Regrater is not a sympathetic figure in his poem. She is an example of dishonest female commerce. But the historian who reads this passage in the context of everything else we know about these women cannot help noticing a few things. First, the reference is casual. Rose the Regrater is not an unusual figure that the poet needs to explain. She is a recognizable type. The reader is expected to know immediately what a female regrater is, how she operates, and what the common complaints about her are. This is a portrait of something the medieval audience found entirely familiar. Second, the specific practices described, thinning the ale using imprecise weights, were common survival strategies in a trade with extremely thin margins. When you are selling small quantities of ale or bread at the absolute bottom of the market, and your profit on each transaction is measured in fractions of a penny, the temptation to shade the quality slightly is very real. This does not make it right. But it does make it comprehensible in a way that a purely moral reading misses. And third, and this is the one that most interests me, the condemnation falls entirely on Rose, not on the economic system that drove her to this trade, not on the guild structures that excluded her from licensed commerce, not on the coverture laws that gave her husband legal claim over whatever she earned. Rose cheats. Rose is greedy. Rose is the problem. The world that Rose is navigating, the narrow, exclusionary, legally stacked against her world, is simply the background, taken for granted, unremarkable, invisible. And isn't that in the end exactly how it was designed to be? The historian Marian Kowaleski, who spent years analysing the commercial records of late medieval Exeter, found something that crystallised this dynamic in stark numerical terms. Women who appeared on their own in the Exeter courts without a husband as co-creditor or co-debtor had the lowest average debt values of all groups, lower than men without guild membership, lower than unenfranchised men who had no civic standing. The fact of being female entirely by itself placed women at a disadvantage in local markets, not because of any individual failing, not because of dishonesty or incompetence or lack of effort, simply because of what they were. And yet, and this is the part I keep returning to, they were there. They were in the records, they were buying and selling, they were in debt and extending credit. They were appearing in court, sometimes as plaintiffs, sometimes as defendants, sometimes as both. Accounting for only 6% of all creditors and debtors in the Exeter records from 1378 to 1388, but there, working with what they had, in the margins, in the spaces between the official structures, with a basket and a route, and the daily discipline of keeping the whole thing going. There is a specific detail about the word huckster that I want to leave you with because I think it says something important. When the word travelled from medieval England to Scotland, it gained a slightly different meaning. In Scots usage, a huckster was specifically a person, usually a woman, who bought goods and watered them down or repackaged them in tiny quantities for resale to people who were too poor to buy the standard market units. Think about what that means. The huckster was not selling to wealthy customers who'd been deceived. She was selling to people who could not afford to buy a whole loaf, who could not afford a gallon of ale, who could only afford a cupful, who could only afford one egg. The huckster was operating at the absolute bottom of the market between poor suppliers and even poorer buyers, taking a fraction of a penny on each transaction, absorbing the risk on both ends, doing the work of distributing food to people who were otherwise simply not served by the official economy. Was this sometimes done dishonestly? Yes. Was it sometimes done with false weights or thinned products? Probably more often than we would like. But was it also at its core a service provided by people with nothing to people with almost nothing, filling a genuine gap that the licensed gilded, officially organised commercial world had no interest in filling. Absolutely. And I think that double nature, the simultaneously precarious and essential morally complicated and economically necessary quality of this kind of trade, is something that deserves more than the word illegal stamped across it in a court record. The women in those court records never wrote anything down about their own lives. No letter survives explaining their reasoning, no diary, no account book. They exist as names attached to small fines. Agnes, Isabel, Marjorie, Joan. Fined 3p for regrating. Fined 6p for brewing contrary to the assize. Fined again the following year. But there is one woman working in a different corner of this history who did leave a written record, who did explain her reasoning, who did articulate in her own voice what it meant to manage money and property and economic life as a woman in the Middle Ages, with a specificity and an intelligence that still astonishes readers 500 years later. Her name was Margaret Paston, and the story of what she did and how she did it, and what it cost her through letters written from a house in Norfolk while her husband spent months at a time away in London, is I think one of the most complete pictures we have of female economic intelligence at work in the medieval world. Her name appears in history the way most medieval women's names appear attached to a man's. Margaret Maltby, daughter of John Maltby of Norfolk. Margaret Paston, wife of John Paston I. But the moment you actually read what she wrote, or rather the moment you read what she dictated, because Margaret never learned to write herself, the name stops mattering quite so much. What matters is the voice, and the voice is extraordinary. Margaret Paston was born around 1422 in Reedham, Norfolk, the only child of a comfortable landowning family. Her father died when she was about 11, leaving her the sole heir to his estates. Around 1441 she married John Paston I, a lawyer, a landowner, a man with serious professional ambitions that required him to spend large portions of his time in London at the Inns of Court navigating the complex and frequently violent world of 15th century English property law, which left Margaret in Norfolk, managing everything, for years at a time. Over the course of her adult life, Margaret produced or directed more than 100 letters, more surviving letters than any other single person in the Paston archive, more than her husband, more than her sons, more than any other medieval English woman we know of. The historian Diane Watt, who wrote a biography of Margaret published in recent years, called her the most prolific letter writer in medieval England. And what is in those letters, once you get past the opening phrases of formal 15th century courtesy, is one of the most precise, detailed, unsentimental pictures of female economic management that survives from the entire Middle Ages. Let me give you a sense of what Margaret's world looked like. It is the 1440s and 1450s in Norfolk. England is in the middle of a period of severe political instability, the years leading into and then through the Wars of the Roses, when the two branches of the royal family, Lancaster and York, are locked in a conflict that periodically convulses the entire country. In this environment, the ordinary mechanisms of law and order frequently break down. Property disputes which were common enough in normal times become genuinely dangerous. Powerful lords with armed retinues make land grabs. Courts are manipulated. Violence is used where legal arguments fail. The Paston family is directly caught in this. In 1448, the manor of Gresham, a property the Pastons had purchased and were legally entitled to, was seized by Robert Hungerford Lord Molins, who had a disputed claim to it, and apparently decided that physical occupation was the more convenient argument. He sent men to occupy the building. John Paston was in London, Margaret was at Gresham. She wrote to her husband, and the letter she sent is, I think, one of the most extraordinary documents of female composure under pressure that I have read from any century. She described the situation calmly. She assessed the numbers of men Lord Mollins had deployed. She listed what the household had in the way of defensive resources, and then she made her requests crossbows she specified and bolts for them and poleaxes. She asked for quarrels, the technical term for crossbow bolts, because she noted that the doors of the house were too low for longbows to be used effectively inside. This is a woman who, upon finding herself in what was functionally a siege situation, sat down, analysed the architectural constraints of the building she was defending, and wrote her absent husband a tactical supply list calibrated to those constraints. She was somewhere in her mid-20s. She had children, and she was asking for crossbow ammunition. She did not ask John to come back. She was managing. Now here is the thing I want you to understand about Margaret Paston's letters. They are not, and this is important, they are not primarily dramatic. The Gresham siege is the kind of incident that catches a modern reader's attention immediately, because we are primed to notice physical conflict and crisis. But the hundreds of letters that fill the spaces between those dramatic moments are something different. They are the texture of management itself. Margaret wrote to John about rents that were overdue, about tenants who were refusing to pay, and why, whether because of their own financial difficulties or because they were testing the family's resolve during a period of disputed ownership, or because there was a more complicated local dispute that needed untangling. She wrote about land purchases John was considering from London, whether the price was right, whether the neighbours were reliable, what the local opinion was of the seller's title. She consulted local lawyers when John was unavailable. She maintained the family's relationships with influential people in Norfolk who could help or hinder their interests. She reported on the political situation, the movements of powerful lords, the mood of local opinion, the intelligence she was gathering from conversations with people John would never hear from directly, because he was 3 days' ride away in London. In one letter, she relays detailed information about the Queen's visit to Norwich, the precise sequence of events, who attended what was said to whom, with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of someone who understood that this kind of current intelligence was valuable. She was in every practical sense her husband's agent in Norfolk, his eyes and ears, his financial manager, his legal correspondent when local disputes required immediate action, and she did all of this while raising 7 children, while running a household, while navigating the social demands of her position as a gentlewoman in a county where the family standing was both a resource and a thing to be constantly defended. I want to stop here and sit with something for a moment, because I think it is easy to read about Margaret Paston and think, yes, capable woman, impressive, but this was just what wives did when husbands were absent. And in one sense, that is correct. We have discussed this already in the context of noble estate management, the expectation that a woman of the propertied class could step into administrative roles when circumstances required it. But I think there is something specifically interesting about Margaret's case that goes beyond the category. It is this Margaret Paston could not write. She dictated her letters to scribes, family servants, her chaplain, sometimes her sons, and she dictated them with a vocabulary and a conceptual precision that is frankly remarkable. She used specific legal terminology correctly. She tracked multiple simultaneous disputes with clarity about which witnesses had said what, which documents supported, which claims, which arguments were strongest in which courts. She distinguished between what John needed to know immediately and what could wait. She exercised judgment consistently for decades about when to act on her own initiative and when to wait for instruction. All of this without formal legal training, without formal schooling beyond what a 15th century gentlewoman would have received, without the ability to write anything herself. Knowledge was in her head. The ability to analyze, remember, prioritize, and communicate it was entirely hers, and the letters are the evidence, more than 100 of them, spanning more than 4 decades. There is a line in a scholarly introduction to the Paston letters that has stayed with me since I first read it. It notes that Margaret was as ready to superintend the defence of her house against armed attack as she was to give directions for the replenishing of the storeroom and the purchase of cloth for her children's clothing. I love that sentence because of what it implies about the range of things a medieval woman of her class was expected to be competent in simultaneously. There was no separation between the military emergency and the household economy. Both were her domain. Both required the same kind of steady, practical, experienced judgment, and she brought the same tone to both. One of the things that becomes clear if you read Margaret's letters carefully is that she was not simply executing instructions, she was making decisions. Sometimes John gave her general guidance: keep an eye on this situation, collect what you can from this tenant, consult this lawyer if anything comes up. But the day-to-day reality of 15th century Norfolk meant that by the time a letter could reach London and a reply returned 3 days or more had typically passed, situations changed, opportunities closed, threats escalated. Margaret had to act in the interval with her own judgment on incomplete information, knowing that whatever she did would have legal and financial consequences, and she acted. Sometimes she was wrong, and she said so plainly in subsequent letters this didn't work. Here is what happened instead. Sometimes she was right, and the matter was resolved by the time John's instructions arrived. Sometimes she told John with a certain dry precision that she had already done the thing he was about to suggest. I find that last category the most personally satisfying to read. The letter that essentially says, yes, I thought of that, I handled it, here is what happened. Not triumphant, not self-congratulatory, just factual, the way a good professional reports to a colleague. I want to tell you about a particular moment in the Paston story that I think crystallizes something important about how Margaret navigated her position. In 1466, John Paston I died. He died with the family's most significant dispute, the inheritance of Caister Castle, and the Fastolf estate still unresolved. Several major landowners, including the Duke of Norfolk, were contesting the Paston claim. John's eldest son, also named John, took over the management of the legal battle. But the eldest son was frequently at the court of King Edward IV, frequently away, frequently in Margaret's clear-eyed assessment not as focused on the family's interests in Norfolk as the situation required. She said so, directly, in writing. She wrote to her son that he was not shouldering his proper responsibility. She laid out specifically what was at risk, what actions were needed, and what the consequences of further inaction would be. She was at this point in her mid-40s, widowed with adult children who sometimes frustrated her considerably, and she was still doing what she had always done, tracking the situation, assessing the risks, communicating the analysis, trying to get the people around her to act appropriately. The scholar Joel Rosenthal, who wrote a study of Margaret Paston's inner life, made an observation that I keep returning to. He suggested that Margaret represents something closer to a conventional medieval woman than the more famous female figures of her era, the mystics, the queens, the exceptional individuals who appear in history precisely because they were unusual. Margaret was not unusual. Margaret was competent in ways that her society both depended on and preferred not to acknowledge. She was doing what many women of her class were doing. We just happened to have her letters. And that, I think, is the deepest thing the Paston letters offer us. They survive because John Paston kept them as potential legal evidence. They survive because after his death, Margaret reminded her sons that their father had valued his writings more than his movable goods. They survive because a local antiquarian found them rotting in the muniment room of a crumbling country house in the 18th century and recognized what they were. In other words, they survive almost accidentally, a small miracle of preservation in a world where most evidence of women's economic lives simply does not exist. How many Margarets were there who left no letters, who managed similar estates, resolved similar disputes, made similar decisions in the gaps between their husbands' absences and left nothing that could be found? The answer, I am quite certain, is a great many. Margaret Paston's letters are not the record of an exception. They are the record of a norm that was almost never recorded. There is one more thing I want to tell you about Margaret before we move on. She never learned to write. This has always struck me as significant. Here is a woman who produced through dictation, through the intermediary of scribes, who transcribed her words more surviving correspondence than any other woman of her age in England, who managed complex legal and financial situations through the written word over distances across decades, who understood perfectly well that documents were power, who reminded her children of this explicitly, who recognized that her husband's letters were evidence as much as communication, and she herself could not form the letters on the page. Her words had to pass through someone else's hand to reach the record. Think about how much intelligence, how much judgment, how much sheer organizational capacity existed in that woman's mind, and had no direct path to permanence, had to rely on the willingness of a son or a servant to sit down and write as she spoke, had to rely on the survival of those papers through generations of storage, neglect, and eventual discovery. We got lucky with Margaret. We got lucky and we got more than 100 letters. Imagine what we did not get. Something that does survive from the medieval period, rare and fragile and genuinely astonishing in its own way, is the work of a woman who managed to turn her words directly into permanence, not through a scribe, not through the accident of legal preservation, but through the deliberate, determined act of writing, and not just writing for herself or writing letters, writing books, writing arguments, writing in the 1400s a sustained, historically grounded, rhetorically powerful case for the idea that women had always been capable, had always been significant, and that the stories history told about them were incomplete and in many cases simply wrong. Her name was Christine de Pisan. And the story of what she built in the years following her husband's death, working alone in Paris with ink and parchment, and a mind that refused to be quiet, is where we are going next. Somewhere in Paris in the year 1402, a woman is sitting alone in a room full of books. She has a candle, she has ink, she has parchment, and she has a problem. The problem is not on the surface a financial one. By 1402, Christine de Pisan has already solved her financial problem, solved it in a way that had no real precedent in European history. For a woman without family wealth, without a patron's permanent salary, without a guild's protection, she had solved it with words. But now she's encountered something harder than poverty. She has encountered an argument she cannot let go of. She's sitting in her study reading a book by a man named Matthias, a 13th century cleric who had written at length about how women make men's lives miserable, how they are deceitful and lustful and intellectually inferior, how learned men, great learned men, many of them had said as much and said it again, and repeated it across centuries of authoritative text. And Christine de Pisan, who has spent the last 13 years fighting her way out of poverty, through intelligence and labour, who has produced poetry sophisticated enough to be commissioned by dukes, and a king who has been praised by contemporary intellectuals and received into their circles on the basis of her work alone, this woman sitting alone with Matthias, and his contempt begins to feel something she will later describe precisely. She feels ashamed. She begins, as she writes, to despise herself and the whole of her sex as an aberration in nature, and then she puts the book down, and she picks up a pen. To understand why Christine de Pisan matters to the story we've been telling, the hidden economic lives of medieval women, we need to start not with her books, but with her life. And her life began in Venice in 1364. Her father was Thomas de Pisan, originally Tommaso di Benvenuto da Pisano, a physician and astrologer who received an offer most academics of his era could only dream of a position, as court astrologer and physician to Charles V, King of France. He moved his family to Paris when Christine was about 4 years old, and there, growing up in the orbit of the royal court in a household that maintained a library and valued learning, Christine received something that was genuinely unusual for a girl of her social class and era: a serious education. Her mother, we're told, had reservations. What use was all this learning for a girl who would eventually marry her father overruled her mother? And Christine would later reflect on this in one of those passages that reads like a quiet personal thank you across 600 years that whatever she became was rooted in what her father had given her by insisting she learn. In 1379, when Christine was about 15, she married Etienne du Castel, a notary and royal secretary, a good man by all accounts, a man who seems to have genuinely supported his wife's intellectual interests. For about 10 years everything was stable. They had children. They had the comfort of a position connected to the royal court. And then in 1388 her father died. The following year, 1389, Etienne died of plague. He died while travelling with the king in Beauvais. He was 25 years old. Christine was 25. She was left with 3 children, a widowed mother, a niece, no income, a husband's estate tangled in legal complications, and as she would later write, no knowledge of how her husband had been paid, what he earned, or how to negotiate with the bureaucracy that owed his salary. I want to pause on that detail because I think it is one of the most painfully honest things any medieval woman ever committed to writing about her own life. She wrote years later that she had not been able to spend her early years learning what would have been useful to her later on, particularly how to look after her husband's financial affairs after his death. Read that again. She had an education her own mother thought was unnecessary. She had access to one of the finest court libraries in Europe. She knew history, philosophy, poetry, rhetoric. And she did not know her own husband's salary. She did not know how he was paid. She had no idea how to recover what was legally owed to his estate. This was not ignorance. This was the specific intentional gap in women's education that the entire structure of medieval gender relations produced and maintained. You did not need to know your husband's finances. That was not your domain. Until your husband died. And then there was no one left who knew. Christine spent the next decade fighting through courts and lawsuits to recover what she could. She sold land. She wrote poetry as distraction from grief, and then discovered with what must have been a certain bewildered surprise that people would pay for it. By 1400, her poetry was known not just in Paris but in England and at the court of Milan. She had become, through sheer necessity and talent, the first woman in European history who earned her entire living by writing, not supported by a church, not maintained by a single noble patron, writing commercial writing for multiple clients, negotiating fees, managing commissions, producing work to deadline as a profession. As a business, here is what I find most remarkable about Christine de Pisan's career viewed through the specific lens of this video. She was not just a writer, she was an entrepreneur. In the medieval world, professional authors did not sell books to publishers the way we understand publishing today. There was no mass market, there was no printing press in Christine's lifetime that comes half a century later. What there was a small, wealthy, literate, aristocratic class that wanted books, was willing to pay for fine manuscripts and could be cultivated as patrons. Christine cultivated them. She maintained simultaneous professional relationships with multiple ducal courts, the Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Berry, playing them against each other with enough skill that no single patron owned her exclusively. When the English king, Henry IV, offered her a place at his court, she declined. When the Duke of Milan made a similar offer, she declined. She stayed in Paris, maintained her independence, and kept producing. She personally supervised the production of her manuscripts, overseeing the illuminations, the painted illustrations that were an essential part of a luxury book's value. She had preferences about artistic style. Scholars have documented that she favoured what they describe as a direct, clear Italian style over the more elaborate, decorative French workshop style of her day. This is the language of someone who understood that her product had an aesthetic as well as a literary dimension, and who made deliberate choices about it. She was by any modern definition a creative entrepreneur managing her own brand. 41 known works of poetry and prose, commissions from royalty, copies of her books held in the personal libraries of Europe's leading intellectuals. She did all of this starting from near poverty in a society that had no structural support whatsoever for a woman who wanted to earn a living by her mind. But the reason Christine de Pisan belongs specifically in the story of women and money in the Middle Ages is not just her career. It is what she wrote. Around 1405 she completed the work she is best known for today, the Book of the City of Ladies. It is a strange and wonderful book written in the form of an allegorical vision. Christine is sitting in her study. This is autobiographical, reading misogynist texts and feeling increasingly distressed by the accumulated weight of male authority, insisting that women are inferior, deceitful, and unfit for education or serious responsibility. And then 3 allegorical figures appear to her: Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, Lady Justice. They instruct her to build a city, an allegorical city with women as its inhabitants. The walls and towers of this city are built from examples, real examples, historical examples of women who had governed, commanded armies, practiced medicine, written poetry, managed estates, administered justice, conducted trade, demonstrated intellectual capability at the highest level. Christine is systematic, she is methodical, she goes through history, she goes through mythology, she goes through the records that existed in the libraries available to her, and she assembles a case. Not an emotional case, not a complaint. A documented, argued, evidence-based case for the proposition that women's apparent inferiority was not a fact of nature, but a consequence of exclusion. If women seemed less capable in learning, it was because they had been denied access to learning. If women seemed less capable in governance, it was because they had been denied access to governance. If the historical record seemed thin, it was because the historical record had been written by men who had no interest in preserving it. I want to be very clear that I am not retroactively calling Christine a feminist. In the modern sense, that word carries a full conceptual framework that belongs to its own time. But I am saying that the argument she was making in 1405 was so structurally ahead of its moment that it would not be made again with comparable systematic force for several hundred years. And she was making it for money, because she had to eat. The companion volume she produced immediately after The Treasure of the City of Ladies is in many ways even more interesting to me personally, and I want to explain why. The Book of the City of Ladies is the philosophical argument. The Treasure of the City of Ladies is the practical manual. It was written for women of all estates. Christine was explicit about this, covering everyone from queens and princesses at one end down through ladies at court, wives of merchants and artisans, and all the way to women living in poverty. For each group, Christine wrote practical advice: how to manage a household's finances, how to deal with difficult situations when a husband is absent, how to maintain relationships with the people your family depends on economically, how to handle disputes, how to protect your reputation, which in the medieval world was a financial asset as much as a social one. She told noblewomen quite directly that they should learn the accounts of their estates, that it was shameful to be ignorant of one's own financial position. She told widows to be strong, constant, and wise, not to collapse into grief while creditors circled. She told merchant wives to understand their husbands' businesses well enough to step in and manage them if needed. She was writing from experience. All of it. There is one passage I want to share with you in spirit, if not in exact words, because it has lodged in my mind since the first time I encountered it. In Christine's Vision, an autobiographical work she wrote around the same time, she describes a moment of being confronted by a man who told her that educated women were unbecoming because they were so rare and unusual, and Christine's response was this, that ignorant men are more offensive. They are even more unbecoming because they are so very common. I have thought about that line more times than I can count. The quiet precision of it. The way she refuses to accept the terms of the insult and redirects it entirely. This is a woman who learned to argue in the environment of the royal court in the company of the finest intellects of late medieval France, while simultaneously managing lawsuits and children and manuscripts and patron relationships, and the constant low-grade crisis of not having enough money. She learned to think clearly under pressure, and the clarity shows in every line. Let me tell you where her story ends, because it ends in a way that I find unexpectedly moving. Around 1418, with France in the middle of a brutal period of war and political chaos, the 100 Years' War was grinding on Paris had been captured. Christine withdrew to the convent at Poissy, where her daughter was a nun. She stopped publishing. She essentially disappeared from public life. For more than a decade she wrote nothing that has survived, and then in 1429, when she was in her mid-60s and had been in retirement for over a decade, something happened that pulled her back. A young girl from a village in northeastern France showed up at the Dauphin's court, claiming a divine mission to drive the English out of France. Joan of Arc, Christine de Pisan, wrote a poem about her. It was the last work she produced. It is the only poem written about Joan of Arc by a contemporary who was alive during Joan's lifetime, and in it Christine celebrated Joan not only as a military and spiritual phenomenon, but as proof of something she had been arguing for 30 years. That what women could do had never been the limit of what women were allowed to do. That the records of female capability were incomplete, not because the capability was absent, but because the world had spent centuries choosing not to look. Christine de Pisan died around 1430. The Book of the City of Ladies stayed in print in various editions for over a century, and then it disappeared, not by accident. As Christine's work circulated, male printers began to question her authorship. She was, after all, a woman. She had signed her books with her own name, included her own portrait in illuminated manuscripts, referred to herself by name throughout her texts. But as time passed and the world changed, the idea that a woman had written this kind of sustained, scholarly, ambitious work became apparently less credible, not more. Her authorship was disputed. Her work went out of fashion. It was not translated into English again until the late 20th century. 600 years after she wrote it, scholars had to explain who she was. She had spent her life arguing that the historical record underrepresented women, and then history demonstrated her point by almost losing her. The stories we've been following through this video, the alewife and her brewing pots, the silk women petitioning Parliament, the abbess managing her feudal lands, the huckster with her basket, Margaret Paston dictating letters in the middle of a land dispute, and now Christine at her desk with ink and argument and a city to build, all of these stories converge on the same fundamental question. Not what could women do in the Middle Ages, but what did they do when no one was watching closely enough to write it down? And that question has one more chapter we have not yet reached, because the clearest evidence of what women were actually doing financially, economically, in the most practical sense, does not come from their skills or their petitions or their books. It comes from the documents they produced at the very end of their lives, when they finally legally, with the Church's blessing, had the right to say what they owned, what they had earned, and who it should go to when they were gone. It comes from their wills. Imagine you are dying. You are lying in bed, probably in the room where you have spent most of your life, and beside you is a notary or a parish clerk with ink and parchment. The church is present because in the Middle Ages writing your will was also a religious act, a preparation of the soul, and for a brief legally recognised moment you're given permission to say what you own, to say who should have it, to name in your own words in front of witnesses what your life amounted to in the material world. For most medieval women, this was one of the only moments in their entire lives when the law looked at them directly and said, "Speak." Not through your father, not through your husband, through yourself. And what they said, the specific ordinary particular things they said, is among the most revealing evidence we have of what women's economic lives in the Middle Ages actually looked like beneath the official surface of legal silence. Wills are strange documents. They are formulaic. They follow patterns, use legal language, repeat certain phrases across centuries. But inside the formula, there are the things people actually cared about. And when women made wills in medieval Europe, the things they named were sometimes surprising and sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes both at once. A gown, a cooking pot, a house to a friend, 6 dishes, 6 pitchers, 2 platters, a pewter jug, a cauldron, a best cooking pot, a cloak, all bequeathed by one woman in Avignon in 1354 to a friend named Aiseline, a rosary of amber to one woman, a bodice to another, a tunic to a granddaughter, a portable altar to a friend, a choir book and the best cloak to another. These were not wealthy women disposing of grand estates. These were ordinary women carefully dividing ordinary things, and the care with which they did it tells us something important about what those things were worth, not just in money but in meaning. Let me start with a number that I think reframes this entire conversation. In 1371, the city of Avignon in the south of France organised a census. It was a fairly routine administrative document, a list of heads of household for tax and governance purposes. This census recorded the names of more than 3,820 heads of household. Of those, 563 were female, 563 women who were heads of their own households in a single medieval city in a single year. The historian Joël Rollo-Costa, who has spent years studying Avignon's medieval records, is clear about what this means. These were not high-status women. These were not great ladies of the nobility. These were individuals scarcely remembered by history, who left only traces in administrative documents. Women who rented rooms, women who kept shops, women who managed small properties, women who were by the definition of the census itself the people responsible for a household, not almost 1/10 of the population, but a significant, visible, recorded, publicly acknowledged presence in the economic life of the city. And they were there in 1371. They were there in other years too. The census just happened to survive. The wills are where it gets intimate. The historian Rollo Costa has studied approximately 60 women's testaments, preserved in Avignon covering the late medieval period, and the picture they paint is both legally interesting and deeply personal. Women in the south of France occupied a specific legal position. Since the 12th century, women who were not under a father's or husband's direct control, widows in particular, and older unmarried daughters in some circumstances, had been considered what the legal documents call sui juris, capable of managing their own legal affairs, capable of disposing of their possessions as they chose. This was not universal across medieval Europe. It was regional. It was more developed in the urban notarial culture of southern France and Italy than in the common law tradition of England, for example. But it was real, and the wills that survive show women using this freedom with a kind of purposeful, specific intelligence that really rewards careful reading. In 1354, a woman named Gaston de Reynaud of Aix made her will. She left a house to a friend. She left kitchen equipment, specific kitchen equipment, 6 dishes, 6 pitchers, 2 platters, a pewter jug, a cauldron, her best cooking pot to another woman. She left a cloak to that same woman. She gave an amber rosary to one woman, a bodice to another, a tunic to a granddaughter. To a different friend, she gave a portable altar for prayers and an embroidered blanket. To another, a choir book and her best cloak or fur. Now I want to think about this list for a moment. Not about its emotional content, though it is genuinely moving that a woman's last act was to think carefully about who would need what after she was gone. I want to think about it as an economic document. Everything on that list was handmade. In the medieval world, clothing was not mass-produced. A cloak was not an inexpensive item you bought off a rack. It represented hours of labour spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing. A decent cloak could represent weeks of a craftsman's wages. A fur-lined one was a significant asset. The kitchen equipment was equally meaningful. Every pot, every pitcher, every pan had been acquired over a lifetime and represented real value. When Gaston de Reynaud divided these things among her female friends and family, she was not just expressing affection, she was making real financial decisions about the distribution of real assets. She knew exactly what everything was worth, she allocated accordingly, and she chose specifically and deliberately to give most of it to women. In another Avignon will from 1317, 3 decades earlier than Gassen's, a woman named Barthélemy Tortos made a will that is, to my mind, one of the most socially sophisticated documents of female economic agency I have encountered from the entire medieval period. Barthélemy's circumstances gave her something to work with. She was the widow of a fishmonger described by historians who study the period as usually a profitable occupation. She had money, and she used it with what I can only describe as strategic generosity. She left funds to the Dominican friars, including bequests to the prior, the boss of her brother's order. Read that she rewarded the brother's supervisor. She was thinking about her brother's professional position within his institution and using her will to strengthen it. She provided money for charities and for the repair of 2 bridges over the Rhône River. She donated support to provide food and clothing to all the nuns' convents in the city. She left rental income to a niece who was a Benedictine nun, and she requested that her own clothes be cut up her personal garments and made into habits for nuns and liturgical vestments for the church. The last instruction is the one that stops me every time. Not just charity, transformation. She wanted what had clothed her body to become what clothed the religious life of women who had no means of their own. It is a gesture of such deliberate continuity, the material of one life becoming the fabric of others, that I find it difficult to read without feeling something. I want to step back from the individual wills for a moment and look at what the population of women's wills taken together tells us. Because the pattern is very specific and the pattern matters. Across the surviving wills from this period in England and France and the Low Countries, historians have documented several consistent features of female testamentary practice. Women bequeathed clothing far more frequently than men. This sounds trivial. It is not. Clothing was one of the primary forms of portable wealth in the medieval world. It was transferable, it was durable, it was recognizable as an asset. When a Swedish analysis counted the garments bequeathed in medieval wills from the 13th through the 15th century, they found 247 kirtles, the basic gown worn by women bequeathed over that period. 247 individual instances of a woman saying this garment which I have worn goes to this specific person. That is not sentimentality. That is asset allocation. The most common bequests in women's wills, clothing, bedding, cooking equipment, jewellery, were precisely the items that the law of coverture had categorised as the wife's sphere, while simultaneously denying her formal ownership of them. Women were expected to manage the household. Women were expected to maintain the clothing. Women were expected to run the kitchen. And in their wills they disposed of those things with the confidence of people who had always known whatever the law said that these objects belonged to them in the deepest practical sense. Now, there is a deeper layer to women's wills that I want to spend some time on, because it is the part that historians are still working to fully understand. The question is not just what women owned. The question is what women owned that we do not know about. Here is the structural problem in England under common law. A married woman could not technically make a legally enforceable will without her husband's consent. Her movable property was legally his. What this means in practice is that the surviving record of married women's wills is almost certainly a severe undercount of the actual will-making activity of married women. The historian Cordelia Beattie, who has done detailed archival work on married women's wills in the Diocese of Ely and elsewhere, found a striking pattern. In the earlier part of her study period, the 1440s and 1450s, roughly 14% of recorded wills were made by married women. By the 1480s and 1490s, that figure had dropped to under 2%. Not because married women stopped making wills, but because the wills of married women stopped being formally registered even when they existed. The documents were made, they were proved in local courts, but they were not enrolled in the formal registers that would preserve them for posterity. They disappeared, and this, I think, is one of the most quietly devastating facts in the entire history we have been discussing tonight. Women made wills. Those wills recorded their possessions, their decisions, their financial lives. And then the administrative infrastructure of the period simply chose not to preserve them at the same rate it preserved men's wills. Not with malice in most cases, just with the ordinary unreflecting priorities of a world that considered men's formal property to be the thing worth recording. I want to tell you about one more category of evidence from women's wills because it connects back to something we touched on right at the beginning of this video. The tools of women's trades. A widow who had run a household and contributed to family income through spinning or weaving or ale production owned in a real and practical sense the implements of that work. The loom, the spindle, the ale brewing equipment, the tools that appear in the background of so many of the stories we have told through this series, and which appear sometimes in the specific item lists of women's wills, not as afterthoughts, as the most important things, because the tools were not just objects, they were income, they were economic continuity. When an older woman left her spinning equipment to a daughter or niece, or the young woman who had lived in her household and learned the trade, she was not just giving a gift. She was passing on a capability. She was saying, "This is how I survived and this is how you can survive." That is what economic inheritance actually looks like at the level of ordinary women's lives. Not estates, not manors, a loom, a brewing pot, a knowledge of how to use them. The wills also tell us something about networks, the specific female networks that women maintained across their lifetimes. Do you notice who receives most of the bequests in women's wills? Other women? Daughters, certainly. Nieces. Female servants who had lived in the household for years. Friends specifically named with specific items allocated. There is a passage in Rollercoaster's research that struck me powerfully. These women assumed that what they had touched or what had touched their skin would also touch another's. Most of all, they expected that their possessions would transmit their memory, their existence, their identity. This is not economics in the narrow sense, but it is economics in the true sense, the management of what we have and who we give it to. And in a world where women were systematically excluded from the formal channels of wealth transmission, where they could not form guilds, could not hold most civic offices, could not own property during marriage, could not sign contracts without male consent, the informal channels they maintained person to person, object to object, generation to generation, were not compensation for the lack of formal structures. They were the alternative structure, built quietly, over centuries, out of what was at hand. We've been following women through estate accounts and silk workshops, through market stalls and convents, through letters and books and the records of small finds. We've watched them adapt to every restriction, find every gap, build every workaround available to them. And everywhere we have looked, we have found the same thing underneath. Not powerlessness, not absence. A world inside the world, hidden not because women chose to hide it, but because the people who kept the official records simply did not think it worth writing down. And in the final part of this story, I want to stand back from the individual lives and the specific documents and ask the question that I have been circling around since the very beginning. What does it mean? What does it actually mean that this entire parallel economy existed, sustained millions of lives, held families together through crisis and absence, and institutional exclusion, produced goods and managed assets and transmitted knowledge, and built networks across generations, and that we almost didn't know? The answer to that question is the most important thing in this whole video, and it is where we are going next. What does it mean to be erased? Not dramatically erased, not burned from records or deliberately expunged, just quietly, persistently, systematically overlooked by the people who wrote things down, by the institutions that preserved what was written by the centuries of historians who decided, often without conscious intention, that the things men did in public were the things worth studying. This is the question I have been sitting with through all 11 parts of this story, and I want to try in this final part to give it an honest answer. Let us do something we have not done yet in this video. Let us count. Not the individual women we have met, the abbesses and the silk women and the hucksters and the letter writers and the widows with their cooking pots. Let us try as best historians can to count the whole. The Avignon census of 1371, 563 female heads of household, in a city of roughly 3,800 families. That is nearly 15% of all recorded households headed by women, and that figure captures only the women visible enough and independent enough to appear in an administrative document. Below them, woven invisibly through every other household in the city, were the women who appeared in no census at all, the wives who managed accounts while their husbands were listed as the head, the daughters who ran the shop floor, the servants who kept the whole enterprise running. Now extend that outward, not to one city, to every city, every town, every village, every manor house, every convent and market and brewery and workshop in medieval Europe, for 300 years. What we are describing is not a minority story. What we are describing is half of economic life. There is a concept that economists use when they're trying to account for work that does not appear in official productivity measures. They call it the shadow economy. In modern context, it usually refers to informal or unregistered economic activity, small trades, cash transactions, work done outside official labour markets. Medieval women's economic lives were in almost every structural sense a shadow economy. Not because they were doing anything hidden, but because the recording apparatus of their world systematically failed to see them. The assize courts recorded women's violations of market rules, but not the decades of successful legal trading that preceded the violation. The guild records noted women where they appeared as wives or widows of male members, but not the years of productive labour they had contributed inside the same workshops. The estate accounts listed the abbess's night service obligations, but gave only glimpses of the day-to-day financial management that kept the institution solvent. The property laws assumed everything belonged to the husband, while simultaneously depending on the wife to manage it, maintain it, and ensure it was still there when the husband returned. We did not know about this shadow economy in detail until historians started specifically looking for it, and they only started looking for it in any systematic way in roughly the last 50 years, which means that for most of the time since the Middle Ages ended, this story has been sitting in archives, unread, or read and not considered worth reporting. I want to introduce you to a scholar whose work I keep returning to because she gave this problem a name. Judith Bennett is a medieval historian who has spent decades studying women's economic lives, particularly in England. She identified something she called the patriarchal equilibrium. The idea is this across the entire pre-modern period: despite significant changes in specific circumstances, the Black Death, the Reformation, the growth of cities, the decline of feudalism, women's economic position relative to men remained remarkably persistently, almost stubbornly stable. They always did more of the lower status work. They always earned less. They always had less formal control over resources. The specific mechanisms changed. The underlying structure did not. And one of the key ways this equilibrium maintained itself was through what Bennett describes as the consistent undercounting and undervaluing of women's economic contributions, not just in the historical record but in the economic imagination of the societies themselves. Women's work was called unskilled when it required considerable skill. Women's trade was called petty when it sustained families. Women's management was called domestic when it was by any practical definition administrative. The word changed. The dismissal stayed constant. Here is what I find genuinely remarkable about this and what I want to leave you with. The women whose stories we've told throughout this video were not exceptional. That is the point. Hildegard of Bingen was exceptional. She was by any measure a rare and extraordinary individual. But the abbess managing her convent's lands and loan operations was not exceptional. There were hundreds of her. Thousands. Alice de Breen, who managed 6,000 acres in East Anglia for 49 years and kept detailed accounts of every herring, she was unusual, only in that her record survived. The unnamed noble wives who did the same work when their husbands went to war or on pilgrimage, there were thousands of them. Margaret Paston, writing her precise tactical letters from Norfolk, she was representative of a class of literate, capable gentlewomen who managed estates by correspondence. We have her letters because they happen to be preserved. We do not have the letters of everyone else who was doing the same thing at the same time. The London silk women who petitioned Parliament in 1455, they were the visible tip of an industry staffed almost entirely by women. The hucksters fined repeatedly in Norwich and York court records, they were the documented fraction of a vast informal distribution network that kept food moving through medieval cities. Every single woman in this video was doing something that thousands of other women were also doing, and we know about most of them only because of an accident of preservation, a set of accounts that survived a fire, a letter collection that moulded in a muniment room for centuries before someone found it a will that happened to be enrolled in a register that happened to be catalogued. The shadow economy was not a shadow, it was the economy. I want to say something about why this matters that goes beyond the historical argument. When Christine de Pisan sat in her study in 1402 and felt ashamed reading texts that declared women's inferiority, she was experiencing something very specific. She was experiencing what happens when a person cannot see their own experience reflected in the official story. When everything they know from lived reality conflicts with everything the authoritative texts say about people like them. When the records suggest that women have barely participated in economic life, and you yourself are a woman who has been running a business, managing money, raising children, navigating legal disputes and supporting dependents for 13 years through writing. Christine's response was to build a city, an allegorical city populated with the women history had failed to record accurately constructed out of examples she pulled from historical and classical sources to demonstrate systematically that the absence of women from the official story was a story about the records, not a story about the women. She was right, and she was making that argument 600 years before the field of women's history existed to provide her with the evidence that proves it. There is a moment I keep thinking about from the very beginning of this video. Do you remember the woman in the East Smithfield Plague Cemetery? the woman buried in 1349 with coins at her belt and a small cache hidden in the armpit of her clothing. She was not a merchant, she was not an abbess, she was not a noblewoman with estates. She was someone who, in the middle of a catastrophic epidemic that was killing people around her faster than they could be buried, had gathered what she could and put it as close to her body as possible. She died. The coins stayed. Archaeologists found them 700 years later. And what the coins tell us, those few small coins pressed against the body of a woman whose name we will never know, is the same thing that the account books of Alice de Deane tell us, and the letters of Margaret Paston, and the petition of the London silkwomen, and the will of Gaston de Reynaud, and the brewing records of Brigstock, and the lawsuits of Annabel Ferner, and the foundation of Rupertsberg, and the 41 books of Christine de Pisan, that women knew the value of what they had, that they thought about it carefully, that they made deliberate decisions about it, that they protected it with whatever means were available to them, and that they did all of this inside a system that was designed at almost every level to ensure that their financial lives would be managed by men, recorded by men, and remembered by men. They did it anyway, with a basket and a basket root, with a letter dictated to a son, with an ink pot and an argument, with a coin pressed to the skin in a moment of crisis. I want to ask you something, and I genuinely mean this as a real question, not a rhetorical flourish at the end of a long video. If we have found all of this, all of these women, all of this economic activity, all of this ingenuity and persistence in the margins and the court records and the accidentally preserved letters of the medieval period, what do you think we have not yet found? What is still sitting in archives unread? What stories exist in languages that fewer historians specialize in records from regions that receive less scholarly attention, in document types that have not yet been systematically searched? The honest answer is we do not know. But the pattern of this field over the last 50 years, each decade of new scholarship revealing more women, more activity, more economic life that had been assumed absent, suggests that we are still finding the edges of something much larger. We are still, in a sense, at the beginning of understanding this. What I hope you take away from this video is not just the specific stories we have told. It is the underlying habit of mind that produces those stories. The habit of asking when a record is silent is that because nothing happened, or because the people who kept the record did not think what happened was worth noting. The habit of looking at what is absent and asking why it is absent. The habit of treating the gaps in the historical record not as evidence that women were not there, but as evidence that the record was made by people who were not looking at them. And the habit of noticing when you find a woman in a historical record at all, in a court case, in a will, in an assize fine, in a census entry, in the margin of an account book, that she represents not an exception, but a trace of something much larger that did not make it into the record at all. We have travelled a long way in this video, from a legal principle coverture, the doctrine that made women legally invisible at the moment of marriage, to the 1001 strategies by which women navigated around that invisibility. We visited the brew houses and the counting rooms. We read the account books of women who managed vast estates. We followed the thread from distaff to petition to parliament. We sat with abbesses who held feudal lordships and controlled the flow of credit in their communities. We walked with the huckster through the narrow streets of Norwich, her basket on her arm, her fine a fixed annual expense she had long since built into her cost structure. We read the letters of Margaret Paston, precise and unsentimental even in a siege. We watched Christine de Pisan turn poverty and widowhood into a career, and then turn that career into the most sustained feminist argument of the medieval world. And we held finally the ordinary things that ordinary women owned and bequeathed: the cloak, the cooking pot, the amber rosary, the choir book, and understood that in those objects was encoded an entire economic life that the official record was not designed to see. You know what I find most moving about all of this? These women were not trying to be remembered. They were not thinking future historians should know about this. They were just trying to manage. They were doing what needed to be done with what they had in the circumstances they found themselves in, inside systems that made their lives significantly harder than they needed to be. The alewife was not making a feminist statement. She was trying to feed her children and earn enough to manage through the winter. The abbess was not performing power. She was running an institution that depended on her making good decisions. Margaret Paston was not modelling female capability for future generations. She was trying to keep her family's estates intact while her husband was in London, and her neighbours were occasionally staging armed raids on her property. Christine de Pisan was not primarily trying to change the world. She was trying to pay the rent. And yet, in doing all of these ordinary practical necessary things in the space between desperation and ingenuity, they produced a record of human economic life that is more interesting, more varied, more resilient and more instructive than almost anything the official history of the medieval period chose to preserve. They did not know they were leaving us something, but they did. If you have made it all the way to the end of this story through 11 parts and this final chapter, I want to say thank you. Thank you not just for watching or listening in the dark as you drift towards sleep, but for staying with something that required patience and attention and a willingness to sit with complexity. This is the kind of history that does not resolve neatly. It does not have a clear beginning and end. It does not reach a triumphant conclusion where everything is fixed and justice is served. What it has is something quieter, and I think more real. Evidence. Evidence that human beings across centuries in the face of legal systems designed to render them invisible found ways to be present, to participate, to matter economically in the most literal sense, to produce value, to manage resources, to build and protect and pass on what they had, not because the system gave them permission, despite the fact that it specifically did not. The next time you walk past a market or think about where food comes from or look at an old building and wonder who paid for it, consider the possibility that somewhere in that supply chain, that transaction, that building's history, there is a woman who does not appear in the record, who spun the thread, managed the books, negotiated the debt, paid the fine, made the will. She was there. She's just waiting for someone to look in the right place. And historians are still looking. Every archive search, every will register, every manorial court roll, every excavated site somewhere in that material, there are more women we've not yet found. I find that genuinely exciting. I hope you do too. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If this video found you at the end of a long day, I hope it gave you something interesting to carry into sleep, the quiet, stubborn presence of people who managed to build economic lives out of what the world left them. That is not a small thing. That never was. Sleep well, and when you are ready for the next story, there are always more stories we will be here.